Not all winter nights are peaceful. Beneath the snow-covered earth, in the frozen silence, the shadows grow darker and the cold whispers secrets only the brave dare to hear. Welcome to Mysterious Shadows. Tonight, I'll take you deep into the heart of winter, where the frost bites, the wind carries more than just the chill, and the stillness hides more than it reveals. So wrap yourself in warmth, but don't get too comfortable. In the dead of winter, nothing stays buried for long. The wind howled around the edges of my tent, a low, guttural scream that never seemed to stop. The fabric strained against the relentless force, bending inward as if the storm wanted to rip me from the mountain and cast me into the void below. The temperature had plummeted overnight, turning the air into a biting, invisible predator. My breath came in shallow, ragged gasps, each one clouding the thin space between me and the frost-laden walls of my shelter. Sleep had been a luxury I couldn't afford, not with the storm pressing against me, not with the shadows I thought I'd seen earlier that day. I had been alone on this climb for days, which was exactly how I wanted it to be. The solitude of the Alaskan wilderness was brutal, yes, but it was also intoxicating, a sharp reminder of how fragile and insignificant we are against nature. This was supposed to be my triumph, a solo ascent of one of the most unforgiving peaks in Denali National Park, a testament to years of preparation and experience. But now, staring at the icy patterns forming on the inside of my tent, I wondered if I had made a mistake. The kind of mistake that would get me killed. The first sign of trouble had come yesterday, just before the storm rolled in. I had been traversing a ridgeline, the snow crunching beneath my boots, and the sun casting faint halos of light across the endless sea of white. It was beautiful in its starkness, the kind of beauty that feels almost unnatural, the kind that makes you wonder if you're supposed to be there at all. That's when I saw the tracks. At first, I thought they were my own, a trail left behind as I looped back along the ridge. But they were too large, too deep, pressed into the snow with a weight that no human could match. The prints were spaced far apart, as if whatever had made them had an impossibly long stride. I crouched down, running my gloved fingers along the edge of one of the impressions. The snow was compacted, frozen solid, as if it had been made recently, within hours, maybe less. My stomach twisted. There shouldn't have been anyone else out here. No one else had registered for this route, and the conditions were too dangerous for casual climbers. Even if someone had followed me up the mountain, there was no way they could have moved faster than me, or heavier than me, not at this altitude. And yet, the tracks were there, leading up toward the summit, in a perfect, unbroken line. I told myself it didn't matter. Maybe it was an animal, though what kind of animal could survive this high up was beyond me. Still, I couldn't shake the unease that settled over me as I continued my ascent. The tracks were a constant companion, always a few hundred feet ahead, always perfectly spaced, as if whatever had made them was leading me somewhere. By the time I reached the narrow plateau where I'd planned to set up camp, the wind had started to pick up. It was slow at first, a low whistle that built into a roar by the time I anchored my tent to the frozen ground. The sky had darkened unnaturally fast, the sun swallowed by thick gray clouds that churned like boiling water. The temperature dropped with it, and I had to work quickly to secure my gear before the storm overtook me. I climbed into the tent just as the first flakes of snow began to fall, the wind howling so loudly now that it drowned out my thoughts. The tracks were still fresh in my mind. The image of their impossible depth burned into my memory. As I lay there, listening to the storm rage outside, I couldn't help but wonder who, or what, had left them. The night passed slowly, each hour dragging as I fought the growing sense of unease gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. The wind pressed against the tent like a living thing, and the cold seeped through every layer of insulation, biting at my skin no matter how tightly I wrapped myself in my sleeping bag. And then, at some point in the early hours of the morning, I heard it. A sound, faint at first, barely audible over the storm. It was rhythmic, deliberate, like the crunch of snow beneath heavy boots. It circled the tent, moving slowly, steadily, pausing every few steps before continuing. My breath caught in my throat as I lay perfectly still, every muscle in my body tensed. The sound was too loud, too close to be my imagination. And then it stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound. It pressed down on me, suffocating, as though the air itself had thickened. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just lay there, listening, waiting for whatever was out there to move again. But it didn't. Minutes stretched into hours, and the storm continued to rage, the wind screaming like a wounded animal. When dawn finally broke, the light was dim and gray, filtering weakly through the clouds. The wind had calmed slightly, enough for me to venture outside and assess the damage. I unzipped the tent cautiously, peering out into the cold, unforgiving world beyond. The snow had piled high during the night, drifts forming along the ridgeline and burying most of my gear. But the tracks were there. They were right outside the tent, deep impressions in the snow that circled it perfectly before disappearing into the storm. My chest tightened as I stared at them, my breath fogging in the freezing air. They weren't human. They couldn't be. The size, the depth, the spacing, it was all wrong. I followed them a short distance, my boots sinking into the snow with each step. The wind bit at my face, cutting through the scarf I had wrapped tightly around my neck. The tracks led toward the edge of the ridge, stopping abruptly, as though whatever had made them had simply vanished. I looked around, scanning the horizon for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. Just the endless expanse of white and the dark silhouettes of the peaks in the distance. As I turned back toward the tent, I noticed something else. The snow around the tracks was undisturbed, as though nothing had passed through. No drag marks, no scattered powder, just the tracks themselves, pristine and perfect, like they had been placed there deliberately. The unease I had felt the day before deepened, settling into my chest like a stone. Something was wrong. Something was watching me. I could feel it, a presence just beyond the edges of my perception, hidden in the storm. I didn't know what it wanted, but I knew it wasn't going to leave. And neither was I. The wind didn't relent as I packed up the tent and prepared for the next stretch of the climb. It screamed through the ridgeline like a living thing, pushing at my body with gusts that felt almost purposeful, like it was trying to force me back. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. Something about the tracks, those impossibly deep, deliberate prints, had awakened a stubborn determination in me. I needed to know who or what was leaving them, even as every instinct screamed for me to turn around. The snow had shifted overnight, filling in most of the trail I'd blazed the day before, but the tracks were still visible, leading upward toward the summit. They were unaffected by the wind, untouched by the fresh snowfall. They shouldn't have been there, yet they were. Each one was perfectly preserved, like an invitation or a challenge. As I ascended, the air grew thinner, sharper. Every breath was a struggle against the cold, each step heavier than the last. The landscape around me was a frozen wasteland, endless white, stretching out in every direction, broken only by jagged ridges of ice and the occasional black silhouette of a distant peak. The sky was a dull, oppressive gray, the sun barely a suggestion behind the thick veil of clouds. The higher I climbed, the more the world seemed to shift. The snow beneath my boots felt strange, not soft and powdery but dense, almost solid, as though I was walking on something unnatural. The wind carried faint sounds now, whispers, low and indistinct, like voices carried from a distance too great to hear. I told myself it was just the howling of the storm playing tricks on my ears, but the whispers persisted, threading through the gusts like a melody I couldn't block out. About halfway to my next waypoint, I came across something that stopped me cold. Rising from the snow was a wooden stake, weathered and ancient, its surface darkened by time and exposure. It was tilted at a slight angle, partially buried in the snow, but there was no mistaking its purpose. It was a marker, the kind used by early climbers to stake out routes before modern tools and GPS. But this stake didn't make sense. There were no records of a route this far up the mountain. My climb was supposed to be uncharted territory, a virgin ascent untouched by any climber before me. Yet here it was, a relic of a time no one had recorded. My gloved hand brushed against the wood, and I felt something rough carved into the surface. Symbols, jagged, intersecting lines that formed no recognizable pattern, weathered so deeply into the wood that even the relentless elements hadn't erased them. The whispers grew louder as I touched the stake, more distinct now, though still impossible to understand. My hand jerked back as though burned, and I scanned the ridge around me. The storm had closed in again, visibility dropping to less than 50 feet. The world had narrowed to just me, the snow, and the faint outline of the tracks leading upward. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The stake wasn't the only one. As I continued upward, I found more of them, spaced unevenly along the trail, some partially buried, others standing tall as if they had been placed there only recently. Each one bore the same strange carvings, the lines seeming to twist and writhe in the corners of my vision, even when I wasn't looking directly at them. The tracks I was following often passed close to the stakes, as though they had been placed intentionally along the path of whatever had made them. The storm grew worse, the wind cutting into my exposed skin like shards of glass. I reached a small outcropping of rock and crouched behind it for shelter, digging into my pack for water and a moment to catch my breath. The world around me was a chaos of white, the storm swallowing everything beyond the immediate space I occupied. I couldn't see the next waypoint. I couldn't even see the ground I'd covered behind me. I turned my attention to the stake closest to me. Its carvings seemed to glow faintly in the dim light, a soft, pulsing shimmer that I couldn't explain. The whispers grew louder as I stared at it, not just a sound now, but a feeling, pressing against the edges of my thoughts, like a presence trying to force its way in. I looked away quickly, focusing on the tracks instead, but the unease lingered, heavy and suffocating. I didn't stay in that spot long. The storm wouldn't let me. The wind seemed to pick up as I lingered, pushing me onward, forcing me to move even as my legs ached with exhaustion. I followed the tracks, though every step felt harder, heavier, as though the mountain itself was resisting me. The snow beneath my boots was slick now, patches of exposed ice glinting faintly in the gray light, and I had to use my ice axe to steady myself more than once. Then I found the journal. It was buried in the snow near the base of another stake, partially frozen, and so worn it was a miracle it hadn't disintegrated completely. The leather cover was cracked and stiff, and the pages inside were waterlogged and warped, the ink smudged and faded. I turned the pages carefully, my gloved fingers trembling as I scanned the fragmented entries. The handwriting was erratic, the sentences broken and disjointed, as though the writer had been in a state of panic, or worse. The entries spoke of a group of climbers, an expedition that had come this way long ago, though no date or location was ever mentioned. The early pages described the climb in detail, but the tone shifted quickly. The tracks appeared on the second day, too large to be human, but too deliberate to be an animal. The wind never stops. It screams at night, like it's alive. We found the stakes. They lead somewhere, but we don't know where. No one wants to say it, but we're all thinking the same thing. We're not alone up here. The last page was barely legible, the words scrawled so hastily they were almost unreadable. But one line stood out, written in bold, jagged letters that seemed to cut into the paper itself. "The summit is cursed. Turn back before the wind takes your soul." I stared at the journal, my heart pounding in my chest. The words felt like a warning, not just from the writer, but from the mountain itself. I looked up at the ridge ahead, where the tracks continued into the storm, and for the first time, I hesitated. The storm seemed to press closer, the wind howling louder, the snow swirling in patterns that almost seemed intentional. The stakes stood like silent sentinels, their carvings glowing faintly, and the whispers in the wind grew louder, more distinct. They weren't random anymore. They were words. I didn't understand them, but I felt their weight, their intent, pressing against me like hands, pushing me forward. And still, the tracks led on. The wind didn't just howl anymore, it roared. Each gust ripped through the exposed ridgeline, slamming into me with enough force to send my body swaying, my ice axe digging desperately into the frozen ground to keep me upright. Every step felt heavier, the weight of my pack and the biting cold conspiring against me, but the tracks ahead refused to let me stop. They were leading me somewhere, pulling me deeper into the storm, and no matter how much fear churned in my chest, I couldn't turn back. Not yet. The stakes grew more frequent the higher I climbed, their weathered forms barely visible through the wall of snow. Each one bore the same strange carvings, the symbols etched so deeply into the wood that time and ice couldn't erase them. I tried not to look at them for too long. The more I stared, the more they seemed to shift, the lines bending and curling in ways that made my head ache and my vision blur. The whispers in the wind grew louder around them too, words I couldn't understand weaving through the storm, tugging at the edges of my thoughts like claws scratching at a locked door. I crested the next ridge and nearly fell to my knees. Ahead of me, just beyond the swirling snow, the mountain's face opened into a massive slope, a steep expanse of untouched white that stretched upward into the gray sky. The tracks were still there, cutting a clean path across the slope, their edges unnaturally sharp against the blowing snow. But that wasn't what made me falter. In the middle of the slope, rising like jagged teeth from the earth, were spires of ice. They jutted upward at irregular angles, their surfaces glinting faintly in the muted light, like frozen veins of glass. They weren't natural. The way they twisted and curved, the way their bases sank deep into the snow without scattering debris, made it clear they hadn't formed on their own. Something had created them, and whatever it was, it hadn't cared about being subtle. I hesitated at the edge of the ridge, my breath fogging the air in shallow gasps. The spires seemed to pulse faintly, the light reflecting off them shifting and bending like ripples on water. The whispers were louder here, threading through the wind in a chorus of voices that felt impossibly close. My stomach twisted as I stared at the ice, and for the first time, I wondered if I had made a mistake. But the tracks didn't stop. They wound through the spires, disappearing into the storm, and I knew I couldn't turn back now. Not after coming this far. Gritting my teeth against the cold, I adjusted my pack and stepped forward, my boots crunching in the snow as I descended onto the slope. The spires were larger up close, towering over me like frozen obelisks. Their surfaces were smooth, but not flawless, riddled with intricate patterns that looked almost like carvings, though they were far too complex to have been made by human hands. The air around them felt different, heavier, the cold biting deeper into my skin, even through the thick layers of my clothing. I kept my eyes on the tracks, trying to ignore the whispers that seemed to echo louder with every step. Halfway through the field of spires, the wind shifted. It wasn't random anymore. It moved in deliberate patterns, circling around me in waves that carried faint, disjointed sounds. At first, I thought it was the storm, but the rhythm was too precise. It wasn't just the wind, it was something inside it, pushing against me, testing me. My chest tightened as the air grew colder, the frost clinging to my goggles, freezing in thick, opaque patches that I had to scrape away with trembling fingers. That's when I saw it. Ahead, barely visible through the storm, was the entrance to a structure. The opening was massive, carved into the side of the mountain with precision that seemed impossible at this altitude. The edges were smooth, angular, and lined with more of those strange symbols, etched into the stone with a craftsmanship that felt ancient and deliberate. Snow and ice had gathered around the entrance, but it was clear this wasn't just a natural cave. It was a doorway. The tracks led straight to it. My instincts screamed at me to stop, to turn back and leave this place behind. But I couldn't. The pull was stronger now, a relentless tug that felt like it was coming from inside my chest. I moved toward the doorway, the spires of ice falling away behind me, their faint glow fading into the storm. The whispers grew louder, their fragmented voices threading through my thoughts, weaving into a single, undeniable command. Enter. I stepped through the doorway, the air changing instantly as I crossed the threshold. The wind stopped, the storm outside muffled to a faint, distant hum, and the biting cold eased, replaced by a strange, unnatural warmth. The walls inside were smooth stone, carved with the same intricate patterns that adorned the stakes and spires outside. They pulsed faintly, the light shifting in time with the whispers that now filled the space completely. The corridor stretched deeper into the mountain, narrowing as it descended. My flashlight flickered weakly, the beam struggling to penetrate the darkness. But the glow from the carvings provided just enough light to guide me forward. The air was thick, heavy, with a presence I couldn't see but could feel pressing against my skin, my thoughts, my very being. As I moved deeper, the walls opened into a massive chamber. The ceiling arched high above me, lost in the shadows, and the floor was lined with what looked like altars. Smooth slabs of stone, each one covered in symbols and surrounded by what I could only describe as offerings. Bones, tools, remnants of fabric long since decayed. The air here was warmer still, the snow on my boots melting into small puddles that evaporated almost instantly. The whispers were deafening now, a chorus of voices that overlapped and intertwined, all speaking the same word over and over. Stay. At the center of the chamber was a larger altar, its surface covered in carvings far more intricate than anything I had seen so far. The light from the walls converged here, casting the altar in an eerie, flickering glow. My legs moved on their own, carrying me toward it even as my mind screamed for me to stop. The air around the altar was thick, vibrating with energy that made my chest ache and my vision blur. And then, as I stood before it, the carvings shifted. The lines bent and twisted, rearranging themselves into new patterns, new shapes, as though responding to my presence. The whispers grew louder, their voices rising into a crescendo that rattled the walls and sent a shiver down my spine. The last thing I saw before the light overtook me was a shadow moving at the edge of the chamber, massive, distorted, and unmistakably alive. The chamber trembled around me. The shadow at the edge of the room loomed larger with every passing moment, its mass rippling like smoke and ice fused together into an impossible form. The light from the carvings flickered, their pulsing glow faltering as the energy in the room shifted. It wasn't just the room that was alive. It was responding to something, reacting to the presence of whatever had begun to awaken. I couldn't move. My body was frozen in place, not from the cold, but from something far more primal. My breaths came short and shallow, each one an effort against the weight pressing down on my chest. The whispers that had been threading through the air weren't faint anymore. They were inside my head now, weaving through my thoughts like sharp, splintered threads that refused to let go. The single word they repeated over and over wasn't a command anymore. It was an inevitability. Stay. The shadow shifted again, sliding along the far wall, its form distorting and reforming in ways that defied logic. It wasn't a creature. It wasn't human. It was something vast, something ancient, something so far beyond comprehension that my mind rejected it outright, shoving the sight to the edges of my vision. But the pressure of its presence wouldn't let me look away. I stumbled backward, my boots scraping against the smooth stone floor, my hands fumbling for the ice axe at my side. The whispers grew louder as I moved, their tone rising into a screech that filled every corner of the chamber. The carvings on the walls flared brighter for a moment, as if resisting whatever was happening, but the light faltered again, dimming until only the faintest glow remained. The air in the chamber grew heavier, warmer. Each breath burned in my lungs, and sweat began to bead on my forehead, freezing almost instantly against my skin. The shadow moved closer, no longer confined to the edges of the room. Its mass shifted and stretched, twisting into shapes that felt deliberate, like limbs, like faces, before collapsing back into itself. It didn't need a body to be terrifying. Its sheer presence was enough to crush any thought of escape. The altar in the center of the room began to vibrate, the symbols on its surface glowing faintly before rearranging themselves in a blur of motion. The carvings were alive, shifting and twisting into shapes that resembled the spires of ice I had seen outside. The whispers in my head grew sharper, more insistent, demanding my attention. My legs moved on their own, dragging me closer to the altar even as my mind screamed for me to stop. I reached the edge of the altar, my hands trembling as they hovered above its surface. The heat radiating from it was unbearable, scorching my gloves and searing through the layers of insulation. I didn't understand what I was supposed to do, but the whispers were relentless, their urgency pounding in my skull like a heartbeat. My eyes flicked to the shadow, now towering over me, its form coiling and expanding in a way that felt like it was watching, waiting. And then I felt it, the hum. It started deep within the stone beneath my feet, a low vibration that resonated through my bones, rising steadily until the entire chamber shook. The air itself seemed to tremble, the soundless roar of something vast and alive filling every inch of space. The carvings on the altar glowed brighter, their shapes solidifying into patterns that felt intentional, almost ritualistic. That was when I realized what the altar was. It wasn't just a relic. It wasn't just a monument to something forgotten. It was a seal. The carvings on the walls began to flicker, their light dimming further as cracks spread through the stone. The chamber shuddered violently, the hum growing louder and deeper, reverberating through my chest with a force that made it hard to breathe. The shadow moved closer, its massive form stretching across the ceiling, its edges brushing against the carvings and extinguishing their glow like a candle snuffed out by a hand. I stepped back from the altar, my mind racing as pieces of the puzzle began to fit together. The stakes on the mountain, the spires of ice, the tracks leading me here. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a path. A trap. I wasn't the first to come here, and I wouldn't be the last. The shadow had been waiting, biding its time, drawing me in like a spider luring prey into its web. The hum reached a deafening crescendo, and the cracks in the walls deepened, spreading like veins of ice. The chamber groaned, the air itself splitting open as a new sound emerged, a deep, guttural roar that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. The shadow reared back, its form expanding, stretching toward the altar with an urgency that made my skin crawl. It wanted out. My eyes darted to the carvings on the walls, the faint glow of the seal struggling to hold against the force pressing against it. The journal's words echoed in my mind, the frantic scrawls warning of the mountain's curse, the inevitability of what lay at its peak. The summit wasn't just dangerous, it was forbidden, and I had broken the one rule I hadn't known existed. Turn back before the wind takes your soul. But it was too late. The altar pulsed beneath my hands, the carvings shifting one final time before locking into place. The whispers in my head screamed now, their fragmented voices blending into a single deafening roar that drove me to my knees. The shadow surged forward, its mass colliding with the altar in a wave of darkness that extinguished every remaining light in the chamber. For a moment, everything was silent. The hum stopped. The air stilled. And then, from somewhere deep within the mountain, a crack echoed like the sound of the earth splitting open. The shadow retreated, its form twisting violently as the carvings on the altar flared to life, brighter than they had been before. The seal wasn't breaking, it was fighting back. But I knew the truth. It wouldn't hold. I scrambled to my feet, my body trembling as I stumbled toward the edge of the chamber. The shadow lashed out, its tendrils of darkness stretching toward me, but the altar's light flared again, forcing it back. The ground beneath me shook violently, and the walls began to collapse, chunks of stone and ice crashing to the floor as the chamber crumbled around me. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The whispers were still there, faint but insistent, urging me forward, driving me out of the chamber and into the narrow corridor. The light from the carvings faded behind me as I ran, the hum returning with a vengeance, louder and more resonant than before. The air grew colder again, the warmth of the chamber replaced by the biting chill of the mountain, but I didn't stop. As I emerged from the structure and back into the storm, the world around me felt different. The spires of ice loomed larger now, their glow brighter and more menacing. The wind screamed louder than ever, carrying with it the faint echoes of something vast and angry stirring beneath the mountain. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my core, that whatever I had awakened wasn't going back to sleep. The storm consumed everything. The wind screamed in my ears, its icy claws tearing through every layer of protection I had left. The snow was blinding, each flake a razor slicing through the air, and yet the cold wasn't what terrified me. It was the sound beneath the storm, the low guttural hum that resonated through the mountain, through my bones, through my mind. It was alive, it was awake, and it was coming. I stumbled forward, my legs weak, my body trembling from exhaustion and fear. The spires of ice loomed all around me, glowing faintly in the swirling darkness, their jagged forms casting long, twisted shadows across the snow. They pulsed with a rhythm I couldn't ignore, each beat in perfect harmony with the vibrations that rumbled through the ground beneath my feet. I tried to keep my focus on the tracks ahead, the path that had led me this far, but even they seemed to waver and shift, disappearing into the storm. The shadow from the chamber was with me now. I could feel it pressing against my back, its presence like a hand on my shoulder, its movements silent but undeniable. Every time I looked over my shoulder, there was nothing but the storm, the darkness, and the faint suggestion of something massive moving just beyond the edge of visibility. It didn't need to reveal itself. I knew it was there. I knew it was watching. My breath came in shallow gasps, each one burning in my chest as I forced myself to keep moving. The mountain was no longer just a climb. It was a labyrinth, a twisting, endless expanse of ice and rock that offered no escape, no shelter. The storm grew stronger with every step, the wind pushing against me, driving me back toward the thing I was trying to flee. I didn't know where I was going anymore. I didn't care. All that mattered was getting away. The ground beneath me shifted suddenly, a deep crack splitting through the ice and sending a shockwave through my body. I fell to my knees, my hands sinking into the snow as the mountain groaned and trembled around me. The hum grew louder, deeper, its resonance shaking the air and distorting the world around me. I scrambled to my feet, my eyes darting around for some sign of stability, but the mountain offered none. The spires of ice twisted and bent, their glow intensifying as the vibrations reached a fever pitch. And then I saw it. Ahead of me, through the blinding snow, was another opening, a massive crevasse cutting deep into the mountain. The edges of the ice were jagged, glinting faintly in the dim light, and the darkness within seemed to pulse with a life of its own. It wasn't just a crack in the ice. It was a doorway. The tracks I had been following led straight to it, disappearing into the void, and I knew with a sinking certainty that this was where the mountain wanted me to go. The shadow moved closer, its presence pressing against my back like a cold, suffocating weight. The hum in my chest grew stronger, each pulse aligning with the whispers that still clawed at the edges of my thoughts. My legs moved on their own, dragging me toward the crevasse, even as every instinct screamed for me to stop. The wind howled louder, the storm closing in around me, and for a moment, I thought I saw shapes moving within the snow. Twisted, humanoid figures that flickered in and out of existence, their faces indistinct and their movements jerky, unnatural. I reached the edge of the crevasse and hesitated. The air here was different, thicker, heavier, and the cold seemed to burn rather than bite. The darkness below was absolute, swallowing the faint light from the storm above and leaving nothing but an endless void. The hum was deafening now, vibrating through the ice and into my chest, and the whispers had become a single unified voice that filled my mind with a word I didn't want to understand. Submit. I didn't want to look down. I didn't want to see what was waiting for me. But the pull was irresistible, an invisible force dragging my gaze toward the abyss. My hands clenched into fists, my nails digging into my palms as I fought against it, but the mountain didn't care. It didn't matter how much I resisted. The shadow had already won. I stepped forward. The ice beneath me cracked and groaned, but it held, the edge of the crevasse crumbling slightly as I moved closer. The darkness seemed to shift, swirling faintly as though something massive was moving within it, its form hidden but undeniable. The hum reached a crescendo, the vibrations so intense that they blurred my vision, and the whispers in my head rose into a deafening roar that drowned out the storm, the wind, and my own thoughts. I knelt at the edge of the crevasse, my body trembling as I stared into the void. The carvings from the chamber flashed in my mind, their intricate patterns aligning with the shapes I could now see within the ice. Symbols etched into the mountain itself, their purpose clear. This was the source. This was the seal, and I had broken it. The ground beneath me trembled violently, the cracks in the ice spreading outward in jagged lines that glowed faintly with an otherworldly light. The shadow surged forward, its massive form wrapping around me, pressing into my chest, my mind, my soul. It wasn't trying to kill me. It didn't need to. I was already a part of it, already claimed. The last thing I saw before the darkness consumed me was the spires of ice collapsing into the storm, their faint glow extinguished as the mountain roared and the world shattered around me. The snow outside had turned the world into a suffocating, soundless void. I'd been in the cabin for weeks now, cut off from any sign of human life, with only the howling wind and the occasional crack of ice shifting to remind me the world hadn't been entirely swallowed by the storm. The isolation was expected. The wildlife team had warned me before I took this assignment. Winter in the Upper Peninsula can be brutal, they'd said. It's not the place for someone who doesn't like being alone. I thought I could handle it. In fact, I wanted the solitude. After everything that had happened back home, being miles away from anyone felt like relief. But this wasn't solitude. This was something darker, something that dug its claws into the base of my skull and whispered that I wasn't just alone. I was forgotten. Forgotten by the people, by the world, and maybe even by the forest that surrounded me. The cabin was small, little more than a one-room outpost meant for researchers like me, tracking the dwindling wolf population in this frozen stretch of wilderness. There were rumors about a pack of gray wolves still surviving out here, and it was my job to find them, study their habits, and document proof that they were still alive. But I hadn't seen a single wolf in weeks. Not a howl in the night, not a paw print in the snow. Nothing, just the endless expanse of white and the trees standing silent and sentinel. That silence, it wasn't natural. It weighed heavy, pressing against me like the air itself was trying to crush my chest. You expect a forest to have sound, even in winter. The rustle of branches in the wind, the distant caw of a bird. But here, it was nothing. No birds, no wind. Just the muffled crunch of my boots when I ventured outside, and the endless stillness that followed me back inside like an unwelcome guest. I told myself it was the storm. The animals had gone quiet, hunkering down, waiting it out. But deep down, I didn't believe it. Not when I saw the tracks. I found them 3 days ago, just outside the cabin. They were massive, larger than any wolf print I'd ever seen, pressed deep into the snow in perfect formation. At first, I thought maybe it was a bear, an absurd thought given the season. Bears should be hibernating, deep in their dens, far from here. But the more I stared at the tracks, the more uneasy I felt. They weren't shaped right. The pads were elongated, the claws sharper, and the spacing between them was unnatural, as if whatever had made them wasn't walking, but stalking. The tracks circled the cabin. I followed them for as long as I could before they disappeared into the trees, swallowed by the shadows beneath the towering pines. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, a fluke, maybe even my imagination. But that night, as the wind screamed through the forest, I heard something. It wasn't the cry of a wolf. It was low, guttural, almost like a growl, but stretched and distorted, as though the storm itself was trying to speak. It sent a chill through me that no amount of blankets could shake. The next morning, I found scratches on the side of the cabin. Long, deep gouges in the wood, jagged and uneven. They hadn't been there the day before. I knew that because I had checked. I'd inspected the cabin meticulously when I first arrived, making sure the walls were sturdy enough to withstand the snowdrifts. These marks were new, and they were deliberate. Not the kind made by falling branches or the claws of some curious animal. They were purposeful. They meant something. I stayed inside after that. I told myself it was because of the worsening storm, but the truth was, I was afraid. Every time I so much as looked at the door, I felt the weight of the forest pressing against it, as if the trees themselves were leaning closer, listening. My only escape was my work, poring over old wolf data and updating the field reports that no one was likely reading. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The feeling started small, a flicker in the back of my mind, but it grew, gnawing at my thoughts until I couldn't sit still. I'd pace the cabin, my eyes darting to the frosted windows, searching for movement that wasn't there. Until it was. The first time I saw it, it was only a glimpse, a flicker of shadow between the trees. It could have been anything, a trick of the light, the wind moving branches, or even my own paranoia. But when I checked the camera traps I'd set up earlier that week, my stomach sank. One of them had caught an image, blurred and distorted by the snow, but unmistakable. Something massive, upright, standing between the pines. Its shape was wrong, its limbs too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. And it was looking directly at the camera. I wanted to tell myself it was a wolf, a big one, or maybe even a person, some hunter who'd gotten lost in the storm. But the longer I stared at the image, the more certain I became that it was neither. There was an intelligence in the way it stood, the way its head was angled toward the lens. Not curiosity, not confusion. Something darker, something calculating. That night, the howls returned. They started faint, far in the distance, and I almost mistook them for the wind. But as the hours dragged on, they grew louder, closer, until they weren't howls anymore. They were screams, high-pitched, guttural wails that rose and fell in unnatural patterns, echoing through the forest like a warning or a call. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. The cabin felt smaller than ever, the walls pressing inward as the screams outside grew louder, more insistent. The scratches on the walls deepened, spreading like cracks in glass. And then, just before dawn, everything went silent. The kind of silence that feels alive, that crawls into your ears and settles deep in your chest. The kind of silence that feels like it's watching you. When morning came, I found the camera traps knocked over, their casings shattered and scattered in the snow. All except one. It was untouched, but the memory card had been removed. Whatever was out there, it knew. It knew I was watching, and it was watching me back. The silence that followed that night stayed with me, like a weight pressing against my chest. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was the way the air seemed to hold its breath, the way the trees outside the cabin seemed to lean closer, as though they were listening. I tried to convince myself that I was imagining it, that isolation and lack of sleep were twisting my thoughts into something irrational. But deep down, I knew better. Something was here. It had been here long before I arrived, and now it was waiting. The first light of morning crept through the frosted windows, faint and weak against the thick gray clouds that never seemed to part. I stepped outside cautiously, my boots crunching against the frozen snow. The cold bit into my skin, sharper than it had been the day before, and the forest around me felt different. The trees stood motionless, their bare branches stretched skyward, but the air between them seemed thicker, heavier, as though it were hiding something just out of sight. I approached the remnants of my camera traps. They were scattered across the snow like broken toys, the casings cracked, the lenses shattered. Whoever, or whatever, had destroyed them had done so with precision. There was no randomness, no frantic claw marks or signs of an animal's frustration. This was deliberate, methodical, all except for the one camera that had been untouched but stripped of its memory card. That was the part that chilled me most. It wasn't just destruction, it was erasure. A conscious effort to hide. I turned my attention to the tracks leading away from the scene. They were unlike anything I'd seen before. Massive impressions in the snow, spaced unnaturally far apart. They didn't follow a straight line, but instead wove erratically, almost like the thing that made them was toying with its path, daring someone to follow. The edges of the tracks were sharp, as though they'd been made recently, but the snow around them seemed undisturbed. No drag marks, no signs of weight shifting. Just a clean, perfect imprint of something that shouldn't exist. Against my better judgment, I followed them. The forest swallowed me almost immediately. The snow was deep, and every step was a struggle, my boots sinking nearly to my knees with each movement. The cold was sharper here, the kind that cuts through layers and settles deep into your bones. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. Even the faint crunch of snow beneath my boots seemed muted, absorbed by the oppressive stillness that surrounded me. The tracks led deeper, winding through the trees in a way that made no sense. They looped back on themselves, spiraled in tight circles, then broke off in sudden, jagged angles, as though the thing making them had no clear destination. But the further I went, the more I noticed something else. Patterns etched into the snow. They were faint at first, just slight indentations around the tracks, but they grew more intricate the further I followed. Circles, triangles, jagged lines that seemed almost like runes. They weren't random. They were deliberate. I stopped when I reached a clearing. The tracks ended there, abruptly, in the center of the open space. The snow was pristine around them, undisturbed, but the air was heavier than ever. My breath fogged the air in thick clouds as I scanned the trees, the flashlight in my hand barely cutting through the gray light. The silence pressed against my ears, and for a moment I thought I was alone. And then I saw it. At the edge of the clearing, partially hidden by the shadows of the trees, something moved. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, just the faintest shift of a shape that didn't belong. My heart pounded as I aimed the flashlight toward it, but the beam flickered weakly, struggling to hold steady. The shape was tall, impossibly so, its form elongated and wrong. It didn't move like an animal. It didn't move like anything I'd ever seen. It stood perfectly still, yet I could feel it watching me, its presence pressing against my skin like static electricity. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place, my mind racing with every possible explanation that didn't involve the word monster. Minutes, hours, it didn't matter. When I finally blinked, the shape was gone. The trees stood still, the snow untouched, as though it had never been there. But I knew better. The air was different now, charged with something unseen but undeniable. I stumbled back toward the cabin, my flashlight beam bobbing erratically with each step. The forest felt alive around me, the shadows between the trees shifting and stretching, but I didn't look back. I couldn't. My focus was on the cabin, the small structure barely visible through the dense snow. It felt like a lifeline, the only thing standing between me and whatever was out there. When I reached the door, my hands were trembling so violently, I could barely grip the handle. I slammed it shut behind me, the sound echoing through the cabin like a gunshot. My breath came in ragged gasps, and I leaned against the wall, trying to steady myself. The silence inside was deafening, and for a moment, I thought I'd escaped. But then I heard it. The scratching. It started faint, just a faint scrape against the wooden walls, but it grew louder, more insistent. It moved along the side of the cabin, circling slowly, deliberately. My heart raced as I crept toward the window, my breath fogging the glass as I peered outside. The snow was falling heavier now, thick flakes obscuring the view, but I could just make out a shape moving through the storm. It was massive, its form indistinct but unmistakable, and it was circling the cabin. The scratching stopped abruptly, replaced by a low guttural sound that sent a shiver down my spine. It wasn't a growl. It was deeper, more resonant, vibrating through the walls and into my chest. The sound carried a weight, a presence that filled the cabin and pressed against my thoughts, twisting them into fragmented whispers that weren't my own. I stumbled back from the window, my hands shaking as I grabbed the journal I'd found in the cabin weeks earlier. Its pages were yellowed and brittle, filled with scrawled notes and diagrams that I hadn't paid much attention to before. But now, as I flipped through it, one phrase jumped out at me, written in bold, jagged letters across an entire page. Do not follow the tracks. It wants you to. The scratching returned, louder this time, as though whatever was outside had heard the words and was mocking me. My flashlight flickered again, its weak beam casting jagged shadows across the walls, and I realized with a sinking dread that the scratches weren't random. They were patterns, symbols, just like the ones I'd seen in the snow. The thing outside wasn't just watching me. It was marking me. The scratching didn't stop. It moved in uneven intervals, dragging along the wooden walls of the cabin like something deliberate but lazy, as if the thing outside knew it had all the time in the world. My heart pounded so loudly in my chest that it drowned out everything else. I stood frozen in the center of the cabin, the flashlight in my hand flickering weakly, the glow bouncing off the frost creeping inward from the edges of the windows. The markings were everywhere now. What I thought were random scratches from the storm's violence or wandering animals were becoming clearer. The symbols, twisted, jagged things that seemed to writhe when caught in the dim light, weren't just etched into the walls outside. They had started appearing inside too. Subtle at first, faint lines along the wooden beams, gouges in the floorboards. But now, they were unmistakable, deep carvings that pulsed faintly in the dark, as though they were alive. The journal was still open on the desk where I'd left it, the faint smell of mildew rising from its old pages. I hadn't wanted to read more of it. I hadn't wanted to see what other warnings I had ignored, but the scratching outside didn't leave me much choice. My hands trembled as I flipped through the pages, each one filled with frantic, scrawled writing that barely seemed human. The snow isn't just snow. It's alive. It's watching. They're not wolves. They've never been wolves. If you see the tracks, don't follow them. If you hear the howls, don't answer. Every word felt like it was written for me, a message from someone who had already been here and had already made the mistakes I was making now. My pulse quickened as my eyes fell on one line near the bottom of the page, written in thick, heavy letters that had gouged into the paper itself. It doesn't want to kill you. It wants to take you. The scratching stopped. The sudden silence was worse than the noise. It pressed against my ears, heavy and suffocating, amplifying the sound of my breathing until it felt like the entire cabin was listening to me. I gripped the flashlight tighter, pointing its weak beam toward the window. The frost on the glass made it almost impossible to see, but there was movement out there. A flicker of shadow just beyond the edge of the tree line, too large to be an animal, but too distorted to be human. I backed away from the window, my boots crunching on the frost-coated floor. My mind raced with every logical explanation I could muster, but none of them fit. The storm outside had subsided to a faint whisper of wind, the snow falling lightly now, but the forest felt heavier than ever. The air in the cabin grew colder, my breath fogging in front of me as I tried to keep it steady. And then, faintly at first, I heard it again. The hum. It wasn't coming from outside. It was inside now, a low, resonant vibration that seemed to emanate from the very walls. It wasn't a sound I could hear with my ears. It was deeper than that, vibrating through my chest and settling somewhere behind my eyes. The carvings on the walls began to pulse faintly in time with the hum, their jagged lines glowing softly like embers. My flashlight flickered again and then died completely, leaving me in near total darkness. I didn't have time to think. My instincts took over, and I grabbed the emergency lantern from the shelf near the bed. Its light was harsh and cold, throwing sharp shadows across the room that made the carvings look even more grotesque. The hum grew louder, deeper, until it felt like the floor beneath me was vibrating. I stumbled backward, my foot catching on the edge of the desk, and the journal fell to the floor, its pages flipping wildly. The light from the lantern caught on something new, a word scrawled hastily across the inside of the back cover, barely visible against the faded leather. Run. Run! But there was nowhere to run. The forest outside wasn't safe, not with whatever was out there circling the cabin. The marks it had left on the walls weren't just warnings. They were invitations, signals to something older, something waiting. I didn't know what it wanted, but I could feel it now, pressing against the edges of my thoughts like a whisper I couldn't quite hear. I moved to the far corner of the cabin, clutching the lantern as though it might somehow protect me. The hum shifted, its tone rising and falling in waves, and I realized with growing horror that it wasn't random. It was a pattern, a language, and it was getting closer. The first knock came from the roof, slow, deliberate, like the strike of something heavy against the beams above. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing as the sound echoed through the cabin. Another knock followed, this one closer to the edge, as though whatever was up there was testing the structure, looking for a way inside. The lantern flickered, its light dimming for just a moment, but that was enough. In that brief flash of shadow, I saw something move at the far end of the room. It was barely a shape, more a distortion of the air itself, but it was there, watching me. The hum grew louder, more insistent, and the carvings on the walls flared brightly before fading back to their faint glow. The knock on the roof was followed by another and another, each one heavier than the last. I didn't know what to do. My mind raced with every possibility, every scenario, but there was no solution that didn't end with me either dead or worse. I thought about the tracks, about the thing I'd seen in the clearing, and I realized then that it had never left. It had followed me back here. Or maybe it had been here all along, waiting for me to come to it. The hum shifted again, and the carvings on the walls began to pulse in time with it, faster and faster, until they were almost blinding. I clutched the lantern tightly, its light flickering again, and moved toward the door. I didn't have a plan. I just needed to get out, to put as much distance between myself and this place as possible. But as I reached for the handle, the hum stopped, and so did everything else. The air grew still, the frost on the windows melting slightly before refreezing in jagged patterns. The silence returned, heavy and oppressive, pressing against my ears until I thought they might burst. And then from just beyond the door, I heard it, the faintest sound, barely more than a whisper but unmistakable. It was breathing. The breathing was slow and deliberate, heavy enough to vibrate through the wooden planks of the cabin floor. I froze, my hand inches from the door handle, every nerve in my body screaming at me to move, to run, to do anything but stand there. The lantern in my other hand flickered again, casting long, distorted shadows that stretched across the walls and danced over the carvings etched into the beams. The symbols pulsed faintly, their faint glow synchronizing with the rhythm of the breathing outside. I took a step back, my boots scraping against the floor, and the breathing stopped. The silence was sudden and complete, so heavy it felt like the entire forest had stopped to listen. My chest tightened as I fought to keep my breathing quiet, shallow, terrified that even the sound of my heartbeat might give me away. I turned slowly, my eyes scanning the room for anything I could use to defend myself. But what could possibly protect me from something like this? The knife in the emergency kit? The ancient hunting rifle with 2 remaining rounds. It all seemed laughable in the face of whatever was outside. The first thud came from the window to my left. I jumped, the lantern slipping in my grip as my head snapped toward the sound. The frost-covered glass was opaque, but the faintest outline of something large pressed against it was visible. It lingered there, motionless, and then another thud echoed from the opposite side of the cabin, as though there were 2 of them now, surrounding me, testing the structure's weak points. The air grew colder, so frigid it burned my lungs with every breath, and the frost crept further inward along the walls. My instincts took over, and I moved toward the journal on the desk, grabbing it with trembling hands. The pages flipped wildly, as though caught in a breeze I couldn't feel, settling on one covered in intricate diagrams and fragmented sentences. The writing was frantic, barely legible, but one line stood out in dark, jagged letters. "It doesn't come alone. The forest moves with it. The forest moves with it." I didn't understand what it meant until I heard the groaning. It started as a low creak, almost imperceptible, like the sound of wood shifting under pressure. But it grew louder, deeper, and more resonant, until it felt like the very walls of the cabin were breathing with the thing outside. The shadows stretched further, twisting and contorting, as though the light from the lantern was being bent by something unseen. I stumbled backward, clutching the journal tightly to my chest, as the thudding at the windows grew more insistent. Whatever was out there wasn't just testing the cabin, it was trying to get inside. The door behind me creaked faintly, the wood bending inward as though something heavy was leaning against it. The frost on the windows began to crack, hairline fractures spreading like veins across the glass. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the thudding stopped. The silence that followed was worse. The air was thick with it, pressing against my ears and chest, suffocating. My eyes darted to the windows, then to the door, and finally to the carvings on the walls. The glow had dimmed, their light almost extinguished, as though whatever force had powered them was draining away. I felt it before I saw it. The shift in the air, the subtle vibration beneath my feet that grew stronger with each passing second. The breathing was back, deeper now, accompanied by a faint scraping sound that seemed to come from beneath the cabin. My stomach churned as the realization hit me. It wasn't just outside, it was below me. The hum returned, faint at first, but quickly rising in intensity. It was different this time, not just a sound, but a presence, filling the cabin and wrapping around me like a vice. The carvings on the walls flared brightly, their light flickering erratically as though struggling against the force pressing in from below. The floorboards creaked and groaned, and I could feel the vibrations growing stronger, more violent, until the entire cabin seemed on the verge of collapse. I stumbled toward the door, my hand trembling as I gripped the handle and yanked it open. The cold outside hit me like a wall, the snow falling in thick, heavy flakes that obscured everything beyond a few feet. The forest loomed like a dark, endless void, its trees twisting and bending in ways that defied logic. I didn't know where to go, but I couldn't stay in the cabin. Whatever was beneath it was waking up, and I wasn't going to wait around to see what happened next. The first step outside was the hardest. The snow was deeper than I expected, almost up to my knees, and every movement felt like wading through quicksand. The wind howled, tearing at my coat and filling the air with an unnatural keening that didn't sound entirely like the storm. The hum followed me, growing louder with every step, and I realized with growing dread that it wasn't coming from the cabin anymore. It was coming from the forest. The trees moved, not swaying in the wind, but shifting, their gnarled branches reaching toward me like frozen claws. The ground beneath the snow felt unstable, trembling with each step, and the shadows between the trees grew darker, deeper, as though something was moving within them. I tried to stay calm, to keep moving forward, but every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to run, to do anything but venture further into the woods. The first howl stopped me in my tracks. It wasn't like the wolves I'd been sent to study. It was deeper, more guttural, and layered with a strange, almost metallic resonance that sent a shiver down my spine. It echoed through the forest, followed by another and another, each one closer than the last. My breath came in ragged gasps as I pushed forward, my legs burning with the effort of trudging through the snow. But the howls kept coming, surrounding me, closing in. The lantern in my hand flickered violently, its light dimming as the shadows around me grew more oppressive. I could see them now, moving between the trees, shapes too large to be wolves, too distorted to be human. Their eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the dim light like embers in the dark, and their movements were unnaturally fast, jerking and stuttering like a broken film reel. I didn't know what they were, but I knew they weren't alone. The hum was deafening now, a constant vibration that rattled my teeth and blurred my vision. The snow around me began to melt in strange circular patches, revealing the dark frozen ground beneath. The air grew heavier, colder, and I could feel the presence of something massive moving just out of sight, its footsteps sending faint tremors through the earth. The forest wasn't just alive, it was hunting, and I was the prey. The forest closed in around me. The snow fell heavier now, almost suffocating in its density, but the darkness between the trees was worse. It wasn't just the absence of light, it was a tangible living thing, pressing against my skin and filling my lungs like smoke. Every step felt heavier, as though the forest itself was dragging me back, pulling me deeper into its grasp. The hum was constant now, vibrating through the ground and into my bones, its rhythm matching the pounding of my heart. The shadows moved faster, darting between the trees in bursts of speed that made it impossible to track them. They didn't need to follow. They were herding me, driving me further into the woods, away from the cabin, away from any hope of safety. I stumbled, my boots catching on an exposed root hidden beneath the snow, and fell hard onto the frozen ground. The lantern tumbled from my grasp, its light dimming before going out entirely, plunging me into a suffocating darkness. For a moment, all I could do was lie there, the cold seeping into my skin and the hum filling my head. The shadows stopped moving, their forms still and watching, their faintly glowing eyes piercing through the black. Forest held its breath, the silence so profound that even my ragged gasps felt too loud. And then, from somewhere behind me, I heard it. A growl. It wasn't like any sound I'd heard before. Not an animal, not human. It was deep and resonant, layered with something primal, something ancient. It rumbled through the air, shaking the ground beneath me and sending a sharp jolt of terror through my chest. Slowly, I turned my head, my eyes straining to see through the darkness. At first, there was nothing, just the faint outlines of trees and the endless stretch of snow. But then, the shadows shifted. Something massive emerged from the black, its form so large it seemed to blot out the sky. It moved slowly, deliberately, its limbs elongated and wrong, its antlers twisting upward like jagged spears. Its eyes burned with an unnatural light, two smoldering coals that pierced through the night and locked onto me. It wasn't just watching, it was waiting. I scrambled to my feet, my legs trembling beneath me as I stumbled backward. The thing didn't move, but its presence pressed against me, filling the air with a suffocating weight. The hum grew louder, deeper, resonating through my chest and making my thoughts scatter. The snow around its feet melted in perfect circles, the ground beneath blackened and charred as though burned by its presence. The journal's warning echoed in my mind. It doesn't want to kill you, it wants to take you. I ran. The forest blurred around me, the trees twisting and bending as though alive, their branches reaching out to claw at my coat and drag me back. The ground beneath the snow was uneven, the roots and rocks catching my boots and sending me stumbling, but I didn't stop. The hum followed me, a constant reminder that the thing wasn't far behind. I could feel its presence, its eyes burning into my back, its growls low and guttural, shaking the air with each breath. The shadows moved with me, darting ahead and cutting off my path, forcing me to change direction. They were faster than I was, more deliberate, as though they knew exactly where they were driving me. My chest burned, every breath a struggle against the cold air slicing through my throat, but I didn't dare slow down. The snow fell thicker, blinding me, but I kept moving, my legs burning with the effort of pushing through the drifts. And then I saw it, the opening. It wasn't the cabin. It wasn't anything I recognized. It was a massive tear in the ground, a gaping black maw surrounded by jagged rocks and twisted roots. The edges were coated in frost, the snow around it melted in those same circular patterns, and the air above it shimmered faintly, as though the forest itself was bending around it. I skidded to a halt at the edge, my boots sending loose snow tumbling into the darkness below. The hum was deafening here, reverberating through the air and into my chest, and the ground beneath me trembled violently. The thing was behind me now. I could feel its presence pressing against my back, the cold radiating from its form sharp enough to burn. The growls had stopped, replaced by a heavy, deliberate breathing that matched the rhythm of the hum. Slowly, I turned to face it, my body trembling with a fear so profound it felt like I might collapse. It stood at the edge of the clearing, its massive form half shrouded in shadow. But there was no mistaking what it was. It wasn't human. It wasn't animal. It was something older, something that didn't belong in this world but had been here long before I arrived. Its antlers scraped the tops of the trees, and its eyes burned brighter now, their light reflecting off the frost-covered ground. It stepped forward, its massive limbs moving with an unnatural grace, and I knew there was no escaping it. The journal's final words burned in my mind. The forest moves with it. The seal demands a life. The seal. The thing didn't stop as it approached, its eyes locked on mine, its movements slow and deliberate, as though it knew I had nowhere to go. The hum grew louder, the vibrations so strong, they made my vision blur, and the edges of the opening behind me crumbled, sending more snow and rocks tumbling into the void. My hands clenched into fists, my body shaking as I took a step back, the frost creeping up my legs and spreading across my coat. The seal demands a life. I didn't understand what it meant until that moment, until I realized why the thing had been waiting. It wasn't hunting me. It wasn't trying to kill me. It needed me. The opening wasn't just a tear in the ground. It was a door that had been closed for centuries but was now on the verge of breaking open. And the only way to close it was to give it what it wanted. My legs gave out, and I fell to my knees at the edge of the opening, the cold seeping into my skin and the hum filling my head with fragmented whispers. The thing loomed over me now, its massive form blocking out the sky, and I looked up into its burning eyes. There was no malice there, no hatred, only hunger, only inevitability. The frost crept higher, consuming me, as I leaned forward and let myself fall into the darkness. The forest was alive with silence. Not the kind of silence that calms you, that settles your nerves, but the kind that creeps under your skin and tightens around your chest. The snow blanketed everything in a suffocating stillness, absorbing sound until even the crunch of my boots felt muted, distant, like I was walking through someone else's memory. I had always loved the quiet. It was why I came here in the first place. But now, surrounded by miles of wilderness, with no sign of life beyond the skeletal trees and the endless white, I was starting to understand that there were different kinds of quiet. And this one wasn't natural. I had been in the Adirondacks for 3 days, holed up in a remote cabin that had once belonged to a forest ranger. It wasn't much, just a single room with a wood stove, a cot, and a narrow window that overlooked the endless expanse of trees. But it was enough. I had come to document the elk migrations, to capture the beauty of the winter landscape and lose myself in the isolation. It wasn't my first trip into the wilderness, but something about this place felt different from the start. The cold was sharper, the air heavier, and the light seemed to fade faster than it should, plunging the forest into an early twilight that stretched on endlessly. On the first night, I'd heard the noises. At first, I thought it was the wind, long, low moans that rose and fell like the groaning of distant trees. But as I lay awake, staring at the shadows shifting across the ceiling, I realized the sound wasn't coming from the wind. It was too deliberate, too measured, like something moving through the forest just beyond the edge of my vision. I tried to tell myself it was just the elk, that their movements were stirring the stillness and amplifying every little sound. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. The elk didn't come this far into the forest, not in winter. And whatever was making those noises wasn't afraid of the cold. By morning, the sound was gone, replaced by the oppressive silence that seemed to follow me wherever I went. I spent the day tracking signs of wildlife, moving through the trees with my camera slung around my neck and my breath steaming in the frozen air. The snow was untouched, pristine, as if nothing had walked these paths in years. The only movement came from the occasional drift of snow falling from the branches above, and even that felt unnatural, like the forest was trying to remind me it was still watching. It wasn't until the second evening that I found the clearing. I hadn't meant to go so far from the cabin. The sun was already sinking, casting long shadows through the trees as I trudged through the snow, following a faint trail I had noticed earlier in the day. It was narrow, almost hidden, winding between the pines and leading deeper into the forest than I had planned to venture. But something about it drew me forward, an invisible thread pulling me along, whispering promises of something I couldn't quite name. The clearing appeared suddenly, the trees giving way to a perfect circle of open space that seemed untouched by the elements. The snow didn't fall here, and the ground beneath my boots was bare, the frozen earth exposed in stark contrast to the pristine white that surrounded it. The air was colder here, biting and sharp, and the silence was absolute. Even the sound of my breathing felt muted, as if the clearing had swallowed it whole. In the center of the clearing stood a cluster of trees, or at least, that's what I thought they were at first. Their trunks were blackened and twisted, their branches gnarled and reaching skyward like skeletal fingers. They were unlike anything I had ever seen, their surfaces covered in strange glowing symbols that pulsed faintly in the dim light. The symbols were intricate, swirling lines and jagged edges that seemed to shift and writhe when I looked at them too long, like they were alive. I approached slowly, my breath catching in my throat as the air grew heavier with each step. Up. The trees, or whatever they were, seemed to lean toward me, their twisted branches casting long shadows across the ground. I reached out to touch one of the symbols, my fingers hovering just above its surface, and felt a warmth radiating from the bark that shouldn't have been possible in this cold. The symbol pulsed once, faintly, and a shiver ran through me, sharp and electric, as if the forest itself had exhaled. That's when I noticed the absence of tracks. There were no footprints, no signs of animals, not even the faint scurry of a squirrel. The snow around the clearing was untouched, unbroken, as if nothing had dared to come near this place in years. I stepped back, my heart pounding in my chest, and turned toward the trees at the edge of the clearing. They stood silent and unmoving, their bare branches stretching into the fading light. But for the first time, I felt like I wasn't alone. The sensation was subtle at first, a prickling at the back of my neck, the faintest shift in the air that made my skin crawl. It grew stronger as I stood there, staring into the forest, until it felt like a weight pressing against my chest, suffocating and heavy. I scanned the tree line, my eyes darting from shadow to shadow, but there was nothing there, or at least, nothing I could see. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the clearing was swallowed by darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight, the beam cutting through the shadows and illuminating the strange, twisting shapes of the trees. The symbols glowed brighter now, their light casting eerie patterns across the ground, and the air felt electric, charged with an energy I couldn't explain. That was when I heard it. A low, guttural sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. It wasn't the wind, and wasn't an animal. It was something else, something deeper, a sound that resonated in my chest and made my pulse quicken. I turned toward the source, my flashlight shaking in my hand, but the clearing was empty. The sound faded, replaced once again by the suffocating silence, and I knew I had overstayed my welcome. I didn't run. I told myself it was because the snow was too deep, that I didn't want to risk falling and injuring myself this far from the cabin. But the truth was, I was afraid that if I ran, something would follow. Something I couldn't see but could feel watching me with every step. By the time I reached the cabin, the stars were out, their light barely visible through the thick clouds that clung to the sky. I locked the door behind me and lit the wood stove, the warmth doing little to chase away the chill that had settled into my bones. I tried to focus on my notes, to organize the photos I had taken earlier in the day, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the clearing and the strange, twisting trees. When I finally crawled into bed, the wind had picked up, howling against the windows and rattling the walls. I closed my eyes and tried to sleep, but the image of the glowing symbols was burned into my mind, their pulsing light etched into the darkness behind my eyelid. And just as I was drifting off, I heard it again, the low, guttural sound, closer this time, followed by the faint crunch of footsteps in the snow outside my window. The footsteps didn't stop. They moved with a deliberate slowness, crunching through the snow in intervals that seemed too even, too measured to be human. I lay there in the darkness, my body rigid beneath the weight of the blankets, my breath shallow and controlled as I strained to listen. The wind roared outside, drowning out everything else, but the sound of those steps somehow cut through it, like a knife slicing cleanly through fabric. Each one landed heavier than the last, the sound vibrating through the wooden floor of the cabin, rattling the walls in time with my heart. I didn't dare move. My eyes were fixed on the ceiling, on the faint shadows cast by the flickering light of the stove. The cabin felt smaller now, suffocatingly so, the walls pressing in as though the air itself was alive. Every creak of the old wood beneath me made me flinch, the faintest shift of my weight sending jolts of panic through my chest. I told myself it was just an animal, something large enough to sound like that. A moose, maybe. A bear. But even in my mind, the words felt hollow. No animal moved like that, with such intent. No animal circled a cabin in the dead of winter, just out of sight. The steps stopped directly beneath the window. I didn't turn my head. I couldn't. Every nerve in my body screamed for me to stay still, to play dead, to not let whatever was outside know that I was awake. The room was pitch black, the faint glow of the stove barely illuminating the edges of the space, but I could feel it, the presence just beyond the thin pane of glass, watching, waiting. The wind slammed against the walls, but the footsteps remained silent, and that silence was somehow worse than the sound of them. Minutes passed, maybe hours. The wind howled, the stove hissed, and the shadows in the room seemed to twist and stretch in ways they shouldn't have. My mind raced with every possibility, every rational explanation, but none of them fit. My fingers gripped the edge of the blanket, knuckles white, as though the thin fabric could shield me from whatever was out there. And then, it moved. The sound wasn't footsteps this time. It was a low, scraping noise, like claws dragging across wood. It started at the window and moved slowly, deliberately, along the wall of the cabin. The sound made my skin crawl, a deep, guttural vibration that seemed to resonate through the very structure of the building. It stopped at the door. My breath hitched, caught in my throat, as the air grew impossibly still. The storm outside seemed to fade, the the wind dying down until the only sound was the faint crackle of the fire and the pounding of my heartbeat in my ears. The door creaked faintly, the old wood groaning under a weight that wasn't mine, and I knew without a doubt that it wasn't the wind. The doorknob rattled. It was subtle at first, barely more than a vibration, but it quickly grew more insistent, the sound sharp and metallic in the silence. My body tensed, every muscle frozen in place as I stared at the ceiling, willing the moment to pass, willing whatever was outside to leave. The rattling stopped abruptly, replaced by the soft sound of something brushing against the door, like fingertips tracing the grain of the wood. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it was gone. The wind returned, roaring against the cabin with a force that shook the walls, the sound so loud it drowned out everything else. I stayed in bed, unmoving, for what felt like an eternity, my ears straining for any hint of the sound returning. But it didn't. The cabin was still, the footsteps and scraping gone as though they had never been there at all. When the first light of dawn crept through the window, I finally dared to move. My body was stiff, my muscles aching from hours of tension, but I forced myself to sit up, the blanket falling away as I swung my legs over the side of the bed. The air in the cabin was frigid, the fire in the stove little more than embers, and I could see my breath fogging in the weak light. I grabbed the flashlight from the shelf near the bed, its beam slicing through the shadows as I moved toward the door. The doorknob was icy to the touch, and I hesitated before unlocking it, my hand hovering over the latch. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath coming in shallow gasps, but I needed to know. I needed to see. Slowly, I pulled the door open. The snow outside was untouched. It stretched out in every direction, pristine and unbroken, as though nothing had ever been there. But just as I was about to step outside, my eyes caught something faint but unmistakable. The wooden frame of the door was scored with deep, jagged marks, scratches that trailed from the base of the door to the top, their edges splintered and raw. They weren't random. They were deliberate. I stepped back, my breath hitching as the cold bit into my skin, and slammed the door shut. My hands trembled as I bolted it, the sound of the latch sliding into place echoing through the empty cabin. I turned, my back pressed against the door, and scanned the room with the flashlight, its beams sweeping over every corner, every shadow. But nothing was there. Nothing except the artifact. It sat on the table where I had left it the night before, its surface cold and unremarkable in the pale morning light. But as I approached it, the air in the cabin seemed to shift, growing heavier, thicker, until it was hard to breathe. The runes etched into the stone flickered faintly, their light pulsing in time with the pounding in my chest. And I felt it again, that same pull, that same invisible thread drawing me closer. I didn't touch it. I couldn't. Instead, I backed away, my eyes fixed on the artifact as the room seemed to darken around me, the shadows twisting and bending like living things. The whispers started again, faint and indistinct, threading through the silence like a melody just out of reach. They weren't coming from outside anymore. They were inside the cabin, inside my head, and they weren't going to stop. The scratches on the door were just the beginning. The whispers were getting louder. By the time the sun fully crept above the horizon, the cabin felt suffocating, as though the walls had shifted inward during the night, closing in around me. Every shadow seemed deeper, heavier, and the air hung thick with a presence I couldn't name. I could still hear the faint sound of them, those voices that threaded through the silence, too quiet to understand but impossible to ignore. They didn't sound angry or urgent. They sounded patient, like they were waiting for me to do something. I tried to go about my routine, forcing myself to focus on anything that might anchor me to reality. My camera sat untouched on the desk, its lens fogged with condensation from the cold. I pulled it apart, cleaned the lens, checked the battery, all while pretending I wasn't stealing glances at the artifact sitting at the center of the table. It hadn't moved, hadn't changed, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that it was aware of me, that it was watching. I needed to get out. The cabin, once a sanctuary, felt wrong now. The stove's heat wasn't enough to chase away the chill, and every time I glanced toward the window, I half expected to see something. Shapes, shadows, movement. I wasn't even sure what I was looking for, only that I dreaded finding it. I grabbed my coat, pulling it tight around me, and headed for the door. Outside, the cold hit me like a slap, sharp and biting. The snow was deep, nearly to my knees, and the wind had picked up, cutting through the trees with a low, mournful wail. It was easier to breathe out here, away from the artifact, away from the cabin's oppressive stillness. The trees creaked faintly in the breeze, their bare branches swaying like skeletal hands reaching for the sky. I glanced around, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement, but the forest was empty, or at least, it appeared to be. I decided to head back to the clearing. It wasn't a choice so much as an impulse, a pull I couldn't resist. My rational mind screamed at me to leave it alone, to pack up my things and hike back to civilization, but my legs were already moving, carrying me through the snow-covered woods. The path was narrower now, the snow undisturbed since I had last walked it, but it felt familiar, as though I had walked it 100 times before. The air grew colder the closer I got, the trees thinning out until I emerged into the clearing once more. It was exactly as I had left it. The snow still refused to fall here, the ground bare and frozen, and the cluster of twisted trees stood in the center, their blackened forms stark against the white backdrop. The runes carved into their surfaces glowed faintly, pulsing in time with the whispers that had followed me here. I stepped closer, my boots crunching against the ice, and felt that same heaviness settle over me, pressing against my chest like an invisible weight. The clearing wasn't empty this time. At first, I thought it was just the trees, their twisted forms casting long, jagged shadows across the ground. But as I moved closer, I realized there were shapes between them, faint outlines, just on the edge of my vision. They weren't solid, not entirely. They flickered like smoke caught in a beam of light, shifting and writhing with a motion that made my stomach churn. They didn't look at me, not directly, but I felt their awareness all the same, a collective gaze that prickled at the back of my neck. I should have turned back. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to run, to put as much distance between myself and this place as possible. But the artifact in my pack seemed to hum faintly, its warmth seeping through the fabric and into my skin. It wasn't pulling me anymore. It was anchoring me, keeping me here. My eyes fell on one of the trees, the largest of the cluster, its surface etched with runes so intricate they seemed to shift and twist as I looked at them. My hand moved on its own, reaching out to touch the bark, and the instant my fingers made contact, a jolt shot through me, sharp and electric, like static electricity magnified 1,000 times. My vision blurred, the world spinning around me, and for a moment, I wasn't in the clearing anymore. I was somewhere else. The air was hot, oppressive, and filled with a deep, rhythmic hum that pulsed through my chest like a second heartbeat. The ground beneath me wasn't snow. It was something darker, something alive, shifting and writhing with a motion I couldn't comprehend. The sky was wrong, a swirling mass of red and black that seemed to stretch forever, and the trees weren't trees at all. They were people. Twisted, frozen forms, their faces locked in expressions of agony, their limbs stretched unnaturally toward the sky. The runes on their surfaces burned brightly, their light casting jagged shadows that danced across the ground. The whispers were louder here, clear now, their voices overlapping in a cacophony that drilled into my skull. They weren't words, not in any language I could understand, but they carried meaning all the same. They weren't speaking to me, they were speaking through me. And their message was clear. The clearing was a prison. The artifact wasn't just an object. It was a key. The vision ended as abruptly as it had begun, and I stumbled back, my legs shaking beneath me as the clearing snapped back into focus. The whispers faded slightly, their urgency replaced by something colder, more deliberate. The figures in the clearing had moved, their smoky forms inching closer, their edges sharper now, more defined. I backed away, my breath fogging in the frigid air, and felt the hum of the artifact intensify, its warmth growing unbearable. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. My legs moved before my mind caught up, carrying me back through the trees, the snow crunching loudly beneath my boots. The forest felt darker now, the shadows longer, deeper, and the wind carried faint echoes of the whispers, threading through the branches like a predator stalking its prey. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The clearing felt alive, its presence pressing against my back, urging me to return even as I fled. By the time I reached the cabin, my hands were trembling so badly I could barely get the door open. I slammed it shut behind me, bolting it with shaking fingers, and collapsed against the wall, my chest heaving with ragged breaths. The artifact was still in my pack, its hum now a faint vibration that seemed to resonate through the room. The whispers had quieted, but they hadn't stopped. They would never stop. I realized then that the clearing wasn't just a place. It was a trap, and I had already walked into it. The cabin felt smaller now, as though the walls had crept closer during my absence. The air inside was stifling, heavy with an unseen weight that pressed against my chest and made every breath feel like a struggle. The whispers had grown faint, but they were still there, threading through the silence like a distant memory. I knew better than to think I'd left them behind in the clearing. They had followed me, and they were here now, waiting. The artifact sat on the table where I had placed it, its surface dark and unassuming, yet radiating a presence I couldn't ignore. The runes etched into the stone seemed inert, but I knew that was a lie. I'd feel it vibrating faintly, its hum resonating in time with the erratic pounding of my heart. I didn't want to look at it, but my eyes kept drifting back, drawn to it, as though it held the answers I desperately needed. I paced the length of the cabin, my boots scuffing against the worn wooden floorboards. The stove crackled weakly in the corner, its heat doing little to chase away the chill that seemed to have seeped into the very bones of the structure. My mind raced with fragmented thoughts, trying to piece together the vision I had seen in the clearing, the petrified figures, the runes, the whisper. It didn't make sense, but at the same time, it felt undeniable. The clearing wasn't just a place. It was a threshold, and the artifact was the key. I stopped pacing and turned to the table, staring at the artifact with a mixture of dread and fascination. The runes flickered faintly, barely perceptible, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching me. I reached for it instinctively, my hand trembling as my fingers brushed against the cold surface. The hum grew stronger, vibrating through my skin and into my chest, and for a moment, the cabin disappeared. I was back in the clearing. The air was thick and oppressive, the shadows deeper and more alive than before. The twisted trees loomed over me, their blackened forms writhing as though they were breathing. The runes on their surfaces burned brighter now, their light casting jagged patterns across the frozen ground. The figures I had seen earlier were closer, their smoky forms solidifying into shapes that were almost human, but not quite. Their movements were jerky and unnatural, like puppets on invisible strings, and their faces, if they could be called faces, were blank and featureless, voids that seemed to pull the light into them. The whispers were deafening here, a cacophony of voices that overlapped and intertwined, filling my head with fragmented thoughts that weren't my own. They didn't speak in words I could understand, but their intent was clear. They wanted me to stay. The vision broke as suddenly as it had begun, and I stumbled backward, the artifact slipping from my grasp and clattering onto the table. My chest heaved with ragged breaths as I gripped the edge of the table, my knuckles white against the dark wood. The hum faded slightly, but the presence lingered, wrapping around me like a shroud. I couldn't stay here. The cabin wasn't safe anymore, if it ever had been. I grabbed my coat and pack, shoving the artifact inside despite every instinct screaming at me to leave it behind. The whispers seemed to grow louder as I stepped outside, the cold biting into my skin and stealing the breath from my lungs. The snow was falling heavier now, thick flakes swirling in the air and obscuring the trees beyond the clearing. I didn't know where I was going, but I couldn't stay still. The forest felt alive around me, its branches creaking and swaying as though moved by something other than the wind. My feet carried me back toward the clearing, the path familiar now despite the deepening snow. The wind howled through the trees, its mournful wail threading through the whispers that seemed to emanate from the forest itself. I tightened my grip on the straps of my pack, the artifact's weight pulling me forward as though it was leading the way. When I reached the clearing, the air grew impossibly still. The snow stopped falling the moment I stepped inside, the ground bare and frozen just as it had been before. The twisted trees stood silent and unmoving, their surfaces glowing faintly in the dim light. The figures were gone, but their presence lingered, a suffocating weight that pressed against my chest and made it hard to breathe. I moved to the center of the clearing, my boots crunching softly against the ice. The artifact vibrated faintly in my pack, its warmth seeping through the fabric and into my skin. I pulled it out with trembling hands, the runes on its surface glowing brighter as I held it closer to the trees. The whispers grew louder, their fragmented voices converging into a single resonant tone that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. The ground beneath my feet trembled, a low vibration that resonated through the clearing and into my bones. The trees began to shift, their twisted forms creaking as though they were waking from a deep slumber. The runes on their surfaces flared to life, their light casting sharp, jagged shadows across the clearing. The whispers rose to a deafening crescendo, their tone urgent now, commanding. The artifact grew heavier in my hands, its surface radiating an intense heat that burned through my gloves. I dropped it instinctively, the stone clattering onto the frozen ground and pulsing with a light that seemed to seep into the very air around it. The clearing shuddered violently, the trees groaning as their branches twisted and reached upward, their forms contorting into shapes that defied logic. And then, from the center of the clearing, the ground split open. A fissure tore through the earth, dark and yawning, its edges glowing with the same pulsing light as the artifact. The air grew colder, the oppressive silence broken by a deep, guttural sound that resonated through the clearing and into my chest. It wasn't a roar, not exactly. It was something older, something deeper, a sound that felt like the earth itself was screaming. The artifact vibrated violently on the ground, its runes flashing in rapid succession as the fissure widened. The whispers had become a roar now, a single, unified voice that filled the clearing and drowned out all other sound. I couldn't move. My legs felt rooted to the ground, my body frozen in place as the light from the fissure grew brighter, illuminating the twisted forms of the trees and casting their shadows into impossible shapes. And then, from the depths of the fissure, something began to rise. The fissure was alive. From its depths came a light that wasn't light at all. Something colder, something hungrier. It slithered upward in twisting ribbons, casting unnatural shadows across the clearing, the dark shapes writhing like living things on the frozen ground. The artifact pulsed in time with the glow, its runes blazing so brightly now that it hurt to look at. But it was the sound that truly shook me, a deep, resonant hum that vibrated through the air, through the trees, through my chest. It wasn't just sound. It was something more, something older, something I wasn't meant to hear. I stumbled backward, my boots skidding on the ice, but I couldn't look away. The thing rising from the fissure was vast, its form shifting and warping as though it couldn't quite decide what shape to take. It wasn't solid, not entirely, but neither was it smoke or shadow. It was something in between, something that defied comprehension. It stretched upward, towering over the clearing, its mass blocking out the faint light of the stars above. And yet, despite its size, it moved with a terrible grace, its tendrils coiling and uncoiling in deliberate, calculated motions. The whispers had returned, louder than ever, threading through the deep hum in a chorus that made my head pound and my vision blur. They weren't just voices now. They were thoughts, ideas, fragments of understanding that pierced through my mind like shards of glass. I couldn't block them out, couldn't silence them. They were inside me, burrowing deeper with every second. The artifact vibrated violently on the ground, the runes flashing in a chaotic, almost frantic rhythm. The light from the fissure grew brighter, the air growing colder and heavier, until it felt like the clearing itself was pressing down on me. I tried to move, to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. The hum, the whispers, the presence of the thing rising before me, it was all too much. My body felt like it didn't belong to me anymore, like the clearing had claimed it, had claimed me. And then it spoke. Not in words, not in a language, but in something deeper, something primal. The sound reverberated through my skull, bypassing my ears entirely, and the meaning crashed into me like a tidal wave. It wasn't anger or malice that I felt. It was hunger. The thing in the fissure wasn't just alive, it was awake, and it wanted out. The runes on the trees flared suddenly, their light cutting through the darkness with a sharpness that made me flinch. The twisted forms of the trees began to shift, their branches creaking as they bent toward the center of the clearing, their movements synchronized like the ticking of a great ancient clock. The artifact's pulsing slowed, its light dimming as though in response to the runes on the trees, and for a brief moment, the hum faltered. That's when I realized what the trees were. They weren't trees at all. They were something older, something that had been here long before the clearing, long before the forest. Their blackened forms, their twisted shapes, they were sentinels, guardians, holding the fissure closed, holding the thing inside it at bay. And now, they were failing. The whispers in my head shifted, their tone urgent now, almost pleading. They weren't coming from the thing in the fissure. They were coming from the trees, from the runes, from the forest itself. They weren't trying to harm me. They were trying to warn me. The artifact wasn't just a key. It was a lock, and it was breaking. The realization hit me like a blow to the chest, driving the breath from my lungs. The artifact wasn't meant to be found, wasn't meant to be touched or moved. It was the final piece of a ritual, a seal that kept the thing in the fissure bound and dormant. And I had undone it. The light from the fissure surged, brighter than ever, and the thing within it began to take shape. Its tendrils stretched outward, reaching for the edges of the clearing, coiling around the bases of the twisted trees. The runes on the trees flared in response, their light flickering erratically as though struggling to hold on. The air grew heavier, colder, and I could feel the ground trembling beneath me, the vibrations growing stronger with each passing second. I stumbled forward, my gaze fixed on the artifact. It was smaller than I remembered. Its surface darkened and cracked, but the runes still glowed faintly, their light pulsing weakly, as though it was struggling to stay alive. The whispers grew louder as I approached, their tone frantic now, and I knew what they wanted me to do. I reached for the artifact, my fingers trembling as they closed around its jagged surface. The moment I touched it, a jolt shot through me, sharp and electric, and the whispers rose to a deafening crescendo. The thing in the fissure let out a sound, a low, guttural roar that shook the trees and sent waves of cold air blasting through the clearing. It wasn't just awake now. It was angry. I didn't have a choice. My mind screamed at me to run, to escape, but I knew there was no escaping this. The clearing, the artifact, the thing in the fissure, it was all connected, all part of something far bigger than I could comprehend. And I was a part of it now, whether I wanted to be or not. The runes on the trees burned brighter as I lifted the artifact, their light sensing with the faint pulsing of the runes on its surface. The whispers in my head coalesced into a single, unified voice, and for the first time, I understood them. They weren't pleading. They were commanding. Seal it. I moved toward the fissure, the artifact growing heavier in my hands with each step. The light from the fissure flared, blinding and cold, and the thing within it lashed out, its tendrils snapping through the air like whips. One of them struck the ground near my feet, sending a spray of ice and dirt into the air, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. My legs moved on their own, driven by a force that wasn't entirely mine. When I reached the edge of the fissure, the air was so thick it felt like I was drowning. The artifact burned in my hands, its heat searing through my gloves and into my skin, but I held on, lifting it high above my head. The runes on its surface flared one final time, their light blinding, and the whispers in my head screamed in unison. I threw the artifact into the fissure. The effect was immediate. The light from the fissure imploded, collapsing inward with a force that sent me staggering backward. The tendrils of the thing within it recoiled, writhing and twisting as though in pain, and the runes on the trees flared brighter than ever, their light cutting through the darkness like blades. The hum in the air rose to a deafening pitch, and the ground beneath me trembled violently, cracks spreading outward from the fissure like veins. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The fissure sealed itself, the light fading, the hum silencing, the cold lifting. The clearing was still once more, the trees standing silent and unmoving, their runes dimmed but not extinguished. I collapsed to my knees, my chest heaving with ragged breaths, the whispers in my head gone. But I knew it wasn't over. The clearing wasn't a prison. It was a cycle, and I was now a part of it. The snow consumed everything, swallowing the landscape in a relentless sea of white. The air itself was heavy, suffocating, and every breath burned as it passed through my frozen throat. I could barely see more than a few feet ahead, the endless drifts of snow blending into the horizon, erasing all sense of direction. The world had been reduced to this: cold, silence, and the faint sound of my boots crunching against the ice-crusted ground. I was alone. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. Out here in the middle of the Rockies, miles away from anything resembling civilization, I should have been the only one foolish enough to venture into this frozen wilderness. But even as I trudged forward, the weight of my pack pressing into my shoulders, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't the paranoia that sometimes comes with isolation. This was different. It was something primal, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end, and my every instinct scream at me to turn back. The missing snowmobilers. That's why I was here. 3 of them, gone without a trace, their tracks disappearing in the middle of a wide open snowfield. It wasn't the first time this had happened, not in this part of the mountains. The locals talked in hushed voices about the winter's shadow, a curse that had plagued these peaks for generations. People vanished here, they said. Sometimes it was hikers, sometimes skiers, and sometimes entire search parties sent to find them. They'd disappear without a sound, leaving behind only their gear, as if the mountain itself had swallowed them whole. I didn't believe in curses. I'd been a park ranger long enough to know that most tragedies in the wilderness were the result of bad weather, poor planning, or sheer bad luck. And yet, as I pushed deeper into the forest, following the faint tracks left behind by the search team, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd made a mistake. The storm was closing in fast, the wind picking up and tearing through the trees with an eerie howl. The light was fading, and with it, any chance I had of finding shelter before nightfall. The forest thinned as I climbed higher, the trees giving way to a wide open snowfield that stretched out like a blank canvas. It should have been beautiful, but there was something wrong with it, something I couldn't quite put into words. The snow wasn't falling here, not the way it should have been. Instead, it seemed to hang in the air, frozen in place, as if the storm itself had been caught in some unseen grip. The wind was still howling, but it carried no snow with it, only a biting cold that seemed to seep into my bones. That's when I saw the patterns. At first, I thought they were tracks, deep, circular impressions in the snow, arranged in a loose, winding trail that stretched across the field. But as I moved closer, my heart pounding in my chest, I realized they weren't tracks at all. They were too perfect, too precise, each one identical to the last, as if stamped into the snow by some unseen machine. They didn't lead anywhere. They just stopped, disappearing into the unbroken whiteness as abruptly as they had begun. I crouched down, brushing away the top layer of snow to get a closer look. The edges of the impressions were sharp, almost impossibly so, and the snow beneath was compacted and smooth, as if pressed by something heavy. But there were no other signs, no drag marks, no scattered snow, nothing to indicate what could have made them. They were just there. A sudden gust of wind tore through the field, nearly knocking me off balance. I stood quickly, my pulse racing, and scanned the horizon for any sign of movement. The snowfield stretched out in every direction, empty and desolate, the tree line barely visible through the thickening storm. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It was the same sensation I'd had all day, a weight pressing against my back, urging me to turn around. But when I did, there was nothing there, only the endless snow and the faint outline of my own tracks leading back into the forest. I forced myself to move, my legs trembling as I crossed the field, following the faint curve of the patterns as they wound their way toward the far side. My breath fogged in the air, the sound of it unnaturally loud in the silence. Even the wind seemed to have quieted, its howling replaced by a deep, pervasive stillness that made the hair on my arms stand on end. The snow beneath my boots felt wrong, too soft and pliant, as if there was nothing solid beneath it. I tried not to think about what might be hidden beneath the surface. The pattern stopped abruptly at the edge of a ridge, the ground dropping away into a steep, snow-covered slope that led down into a narrow valley. I hesitated, peering over the edge, but the storm had grown too thick to see more than a few feet ahead. I should have turned back. I should have taken the patterns as a warning and left this place behind. But something compelled me to keep going, a pull I couldn't explain, like an invisible thread tugging me forward. The first sign of the town was the steeple. It rose out of the snow like a jagged tooth, the wood dark and weathered, its pointed tip leaning precariously to one side. As I descended the ridge, the rest of the town came into view. Half-buried cabins, crumbling storefronts, and the skeletal remains of what must have once been a thriving mining settlement. It was a ghost town now, abandoned to the elements, its buildings half swallowed by the relentless snow. I made my way to the nearest cabin, my boots crunching loudly against the ice as I approached. The door was hanging off its hinges, the wood warped and splintered, and the interior was dark, the faint smell of rot wafting out into the cold air. I stepped inside, my flashlight cutting through the shadows, and my stomach turned at what I saw. There were no bodies, no signs of life, only the remains of what must have been a hasty departure. Furniture lay overturned, papers scattered across the floor, and strange symbols etched into the walls, their jagged lines burned into the wood as if by fire. The air was colder here, the kind of cold that made it hard to breathe, and the silence was so absolute it felt as though the cabin itself was holding its breath. I found the snowmobiler's gear in the next building, a tangle of coats, gloves, and backpacks piled haphazardly in the corner. But there were no footprints, no signs of a struggle. It was as if they had vanished into thin air, leaving their belongings behind without so much as a sound. And yet, as I stood there, staring at the abandoned gear, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The first noise came just after nightfall, a low, guttural scraping that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. I froze, my flashlight trembling in my hand, as the sound grew louder, closer, until it was just outside the cabin. I didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe, as the door creaked softly, the sound of it opening blending seamlessly with the wind. And then, Just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. It wrapped around me like a second skin, suffocating and heavy, as though the very air in the room had frozen solid. My flashlight's beam quivered across the splintered walls, catching on the strange, jagged symbols that seemed to leer back at me with an almost malevolent awareness. I strained to hear something, anything, that might explain the sound I'd just heard, but there was nothing. No footsteps, no wind, just the unnatural stillness of the cabin and the pounding of my heart echoing in my ears. I wanted to tell myself it had been the storm, some loose branch scraping against the wood, or maybe even an animal scavenging for shelter. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The sound hadn't come from outside the cabin, it had come from within. And whatever had made it was no longer here, or at least not in any way that I could see. I should have left then. Every instinct was screaming at me to grab my pack and run, to put as much distance as I could between myself and this cursed place. But the storm outside was growing worse, the wind howling with a fury that rattled the cabin's rotting beams, and I knew I wouldn't make it far in the dark. My only option was to wait until morning, to try and rest until the first light of dawn, even though the thought of closing my eyes in this place made my skin crawl. I moved to the farthest corner of the cabin, positioning myself so I could see both the door and the single frost-covered window. My flashlight stayed clenched in one hand, the other gripping the handle of my knife. The beam danced across the room in sporadic bursts as I scanned the shadows, looking for any sign of movement. The strange markings on the walls seemed to shift under the light, their jagged edges twisting into patterns that made my head ache if I stared too long. I forced myself to look away, focusing instead on the cold, hard floor beneath me. Time passed, slowly. The storm raged on, the wind battering the walls with a ferocity that made the entire structure groan and shudder. Every so often, I thought I heard something beneath the storm, a low, rhythmic thumping, like the sound of a massive heartbeat pulsing through the earth. I tried to dismiss it as the wind, as the creaking of the old wood, but it was too steady, too deliberate. It felt as though it was coming from below me, resonating through the frozen ground and into my bones. At some point I must have dozed off, because the next thing I remember is waking to an overwhelming sense of wrongness. The air in the cabin was colder than before, almost unbearably so, and the dim light of my flashlight had flickered out, plunging the room into an oppressive darkness. My breath fogged in the icy air, each exhale catching the faintest hint of movement, shadows shifting at the edges of my vision, too quick and too faint to fully register. I reached for my flashlight, fumbling with stiff, frozen fingers, and turned it on. The beam cut through the darkness, sweeping across the room in a frantic arc. The cabin was empty, or at least it appeared to be. The door was still shut, the window frosted over, and yet the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. It pressed down on me like a physical weight, making my chest ache and my pulse race. I scanned the walls, the strange symbols glaring back at me with an intensity that seemed brighter, sharper than before. And then I saw it. In the far corner of the room, just beyond the reach of my flashlight's beam, the shadows shifted again. It wasn't the flicker of light or the movement of my hand. It was deliberate, slow, almost human. My breath caught in my throat as I focused the beam on the corner, but there was nothing there. Just the rough, splintered wall and the strange, etched markings. I didn't move. I couldn't. My body was locked in place, every muscle tense and frozen as I stared into the empty corner. The air seemed to thicken around me, the silence broken only by the faint sound of my breathing. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the feeling lifted. The air returned to normal, the weight on my chest easing as the room seemed to exhale around me. The corner was empty again, the shadows still. I forced myself to breathe, my hands trembling as I lowered the flashlight. Whatever had just happened, I couldn't explain it. And I wasn't sure I wanted to. All I knew was that I needed to leave. Storm or no storm, I couldn't stay here another second. I grabbed my pack and moved toward the door, my boots crunching softly against the frost-covered floor. My hand hovered over the doorknob, hesitating for just a moment before I twisted it and pulled the door open. The cold outside hit me like a wall, stealing the breath from my lungs as the wind howled around me. But it wasn't the cold that stopped me in my tracks. It was the footprints. They stretched out in a wide arc around the cabin, deep impressions in the snow that hadn't been there before. Each print was massive, far larger than any animal I'd ever seen, and they led in a slow, deliberate path that circled the building. I stepped outside cautiously, the flashlight trembling in my grip as I followed the trail with my eyes. The prints continued around the cabin, disappearing into the storm on one side and reappearing on the other, as though whatever had made them had been pacing around me while I slept. The thumping sound returned, louder now, its rhythm pounding in my chest as the ground beneath me seemed to tremble. I turned toward the forest, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the swirling snow, and for a brief moment I thought I saw something. A shape, massive and indistinct, moving between the trees. It was gone before I could focus on it, swallowed by the storm, but the feeling of being watched returned, sharper than ever. I didn't wait to see if it would come back. My legs moved on their own, carrying me toward the tree line and away from the cabin as fast as the deep snow would allow. The wind howled around me, tearing at my clothes and muffling the sound of my footsteps, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. The forest loomed ahead, dark and foreboding, but it was the only place I could go. The only place I might find answers. Or at least, that's what I told myself. The forest swallowed me whole. The snow was deeper here, almost up to my knees, and every step felt like a battle. The storm wrapped around the trees like a living thing, a swirling mass of white that seemed to pull me in deeper, farther from any hope of escape. The footprints I had seen outside the cabin were gone now, lost in the endless drifts, but I knew they hadn't disappeared. They were just hidden, waiting for the storm to ease, waiting for me to stop moving. But I couldn't stop. Not now. Now? Not after what I'd seen. The wind screamed through the branches above me, tearing at my coat and freezing the sweat that clung to my skin. My breath came in sharp, shallow gasps, each exhale fogging the air in front of me. The flashlight in my hand was dim now, the batteries struggling against the relentless cold, and the beam flickered as I scanned the path ahead. The trees were skeletal, their bare branches clawing at the sky like broken fingers. They stretched high above me, their trunks gnarled and twisted, and every so often, I thought I saw shapes moving between them. Dark, hulking figures that disappeared the moment I turned my head. The ground beneath me began to change as I pushed deeper into the forest. The snow grew firmer, the crust crunching loudly beneath my boots, and the air grew colder, the biting chill sinking deep into my bones. The light of the storm seemed to dim, as though the sky itself had grown darker, and the forest around me took on an eerie stillness that made my stomach twist. Even the wind seemed to die here, its howling replaced by a suffocating silence that pressed against my ears. It was then that I noticed the tracks again, not the massive, deliberate prints I'd seen around the cabin, but something smaller, more chaotic. They were scattered across the snow in strange, overlapping patterns, as though a dozen creatures had scurried through the trees, their movements frantic and aimless. The shapes of the tracks were wrong, their edges jagged and uneven, and the longer I stared at them, the more my head ached. It was as if the snow itself resisted holding the shape of whatever had passed through it. I crouched down, brushing away the top layer of snow to get a better look. The tracks were shallow, barely more than impressions, but there was something about them that made my skin crawl. They didn't belong to any animal I knew. The shapes were almost human, but distorted, elongated, as though the limbs that had made them weren't designed for walking. My fingers brushed against the icy ground, and a sudden jolt of cold shot through me, sharp and electric. I recoiled, my breath catching in my throat as the faintest whisper seemed to echo through the trees. I stood quickly, scanning the forest around me, but there was nothing there. The trees stood silent and unmoving, their shadows stretching across the snow like dark veins. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was the same sensation I'd felt at the cabin, the same weight pressing against my back, urging me to turn around. But when I did, the path behind me was empty, the snow untouched except for my own tracks. The whispers returned, faint and fragmented, threading through the silence like strands of smoke. They didn't come from any one direction. Instead, they seemed to emanate from the forest itself, weaving between the trees and wrapping around me in a suffocating embrace. I couldn't understand the words, if they were even words, but the tone was unmistakable. They weren't inviting me deeper. They were warning me to leave. I moved faster now, my boots crunching loudly against the snow as I pushed through the underbrush. The flashlight flickered again, the beam struggling to cut through the thickening storm, and for a moment I considered turning back. But something in the distance caught my eye, a faint glow, barely visible through the trees. It was faint and flickering, like the dying embers of a fire, and it drew me forward despite every instinct screaming at me to run in the opposite direction. The glow grew brighter as I approached, the faint orange light cutting through the gray of the storm. It wasn't fire. Not exactly. It was something else, something colder, and it seemed to pulse in time with the pounding of my heart. The ground beneath me began to tremble, a low vibration that resonated through my boots and into my chest, and the whispers grew louder, their tones shifting from a warning to something more urgent. When I finally reached the source of the light, my breath caught in my throat. It was a cave, or at least what had once been a cave. The entrance had collapsed, the jagged edges of the rock dusted with frost, and the ground around it was littered with strange, blackened shards that looked like charred bone. The light emanated from deep within, its source hidden behind the debris, and the air around it was warmer, almost humid, despite the freezing temperatures. The snow at the entrance had melted, leaving behind a slick, icy surface that gleamed faintly in the light. I hesitated at the edge of the cave, my flashlight beam trembling as it illuminated the dark, gaping hole. The whispers were louder here, their fragmented voices threading through the hum that seemed to emanate from the ground itself. I couldn't tell if they were coming from within the cave or if they were in my head, but the effect was the same. My legs felt rooted to the ground, my body frozen in place as the light pulsed rhythmically, drawing me closer. I stepped inside. The air changed immediately, the biting cold replaced by an oppressive heat that clung to my skin and made it hard to breathe. The walls of the cave were slick with moisture, their surfaces carved with strange, jagged patterns that glowed faintly in the dim light. The floor was uneven, littered with debris and patches of ice that crunched loudly beneath my boots. And the deeper I went, the stronger the vibrations grew, each one resonating through the air like the beat of a massive drum. The whispers followed me, growing louder and more coherent as I descended. They overlapped and intertwined, their voices blending into a single dissonant tone that made my head throb. They weren't angry. Not yet. But there was a weight to them, a sense of urgency that pressed against my thoughts like an unseen hand. And then, as I rounded a corner, the cave opened into a massive chamber. The light was blinding here, its source a massive, glowing pillar of ice that rose from the center of the room like a frozen monument. The air was warmer still, thick and heavy, and the vibrations were almost unbearable, each one shaking the ground beneath my feet. The walls of the chamber were covered in the same jagged symbols I'd seen outside, their edges glowing faintly as though they were alive. And at the base of the pillar, half buried in the ice, was a figure. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything. The figure embedded in the ice was wrong. Wrong in a way that made my stomach churn and my pulse pound in my ears. Its proportions were almost human, but stretched and distorted, as though something had tried to imitate the human form and failed. Its limbs were too long, its torso too narrow, and its face, or what passed for one, was a smooth, featureless plain, absent of eyes, a nose, or even a mouth. The ice around it shimmered faintly, the jagged runes etched into its surface, pulsing with the same eerie rhythm as the vibrations in the ground. The whispers swelled, louder now, almost frantic. They seemed to emanate from the walls, the ice, the very air itself, their voices overlapping in a cacophony that pressed against my skull like a vice. I stumbled forward, my breath catching in my throat as the glow from the pillar of ice intensified, bathing the chamber in an unnatural flickering light. The air was thick with heat, each breath burning in my lungs as though the chamber itself were alive. I moved closer to the pillar, drawn forward despite every instinct screaming at me to run. The figure inside was motionless, but there was a tension to it, a coiled energy that made my skin crawl. Its limbs were twisted at impossible angles, its hands claw-like and elongated, the tips of its fingers barely brushing the edges of the ice. The runes glowed brighter as I approached, their light sharp and searing, and I felt the faintest hint of resistance in the air, like walking against a current. And then it moved. It was subtle at first, a twitch of the fingers, a faint shift of the head, but it was enough to send a jolt of panic through my chest. I froze, my flashlight trembling in my grip as the whispers crescendoed into a single deafening roar. The figure's head turned, slowly, its featureless face angling toward me with a deliberate precision that made my knees weak. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, as it pressed one long spindly hand against the ice, its fingers splayed wide. The pillar cracked. The sound was sharp and violent, echoing through the chamber like a gunshot. A jagged fissure split the ice from top to bottom, the glowing runes flaring and then flickering, their light dimming as the vibrations in the ground grew stronger. The air seemed to collapse inward, the oppressive heat replaced by an icy chill that seeped into my bones. The whispers cut out abruptly, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt like the world had stopped breathing. And then the figure stepped forward. The ice shattered around it, fragments spraying outward in a burst of light and sound. The figure moved with a fluid, inhuman grace, its long limbs unfolding as it emerged from the pillar. Its featureless face turned toward me, and though it had no eyes, I felt its gaze boring into me, cold and unrelenting. The runes on the walls flared to life again, their light casting jagged shadows across the chamber. And the whispers returned, their tone sharper now, more urgent. I stumbled backward, my heart hammering in my chest as the figure took a step toward me. The vibrations in the ground were deafening now, the entire chamber shaking with a force that made it hard to stay upright. The figure's movements were slow and deliberate, each step calculated and precise, as though it had all the time in the world. The air grew colder with each step it took, the heat from before replaced by an icy numbness that made my breath fog in the dim light. I turned and ran. The chamber seemed to stretch endlessly, the walls closing in as the light from the runes flickered and dimmed. The whispers followed me, growing louder with each step, their fragmented voices blending into a single resonant tone that made my head throb. The vibrations in the ground were relentless, the tremors threatening to knock me off my feet as I scrambled toward the narrow passage that had brought me here. The figure didn't follow, but I could feel it behind me, its presence pressing against my back like an invisible hand. The air grew heavier, the cold more biting, and I could hear the faint sound of its footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing faintly against the ice-covered walls. It wasn't in a hurry. It didn't need to be. It knew I couldn't escape. The passage was darker than I remembered, the light from my flashlight barely cutting through the oppressive blackness. The walls seemed closer now, the jagged symbols etched into their surfaces glowing faintly as I passed. The whispers were softer here, but no less urgent, their fragmented voices threading through the silence like strands of smoke. They weren't speaking to me. They were speaking through me. The ground beneath me trembled violently, a sharp, jarring movement that sent me sprawling to the floor. My flashlight skittered across the ice, its beam flickering wildly as it spun to a stop. I scrambled to my feet, my hands slipping on the slick surface, and snatched the flashlight, turning it toward the passage behind me. The figure was there. It stood motionless at the far end of the passage, its long twisted limbs illuminated faintly by the flickering light. The runes on its body glowed brighter now, their edges sharp and jagged, and the air around it seemed to ripple, as though the space it occupied was bending under the weight of its presence. It didn't move, didn't advance, but the pressure in the air grew stronger, pressing against my chest and making it hard to breathe. I turned and ran again, the sound of my boots echoing through the narrow corridor as the whispers reached a fever pitch. The passage sloped upward, the air growing colder with each step, and I could see the faintest hint of daylight ahead. The vibrations in the ground were less intense here, but the sense of being followed was stronger than ever. The figure wasn't far behind. I didn't need to look back to know that. The passage opened onto the forest, the storm still raging as the wind howled through the trees. The snow was deeper now, the drifts nearly waist high, and every step was an effort. The cold bit into my skin, sharp and relentless, but it was nothing compared to the chill I'd felt in the chamber. I pushed forward, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I scanned the forest for any sign of movement. And then the ground beneath me gave way. The snow collapsed, a deep, yawning sinkhole opening beneath my feet. I barely had time to react before I was falling, the world spinning around me as the icy wind tore at my clothes. The whispers were deafening now, their tone sharper, more urgent, as the darkness swallowed me whole. The fall felt endless, the icy wind tearing at my skin as the darkness swallowed me whole. The world above disappeared in an instant, leaving me suspended in the void, weightless and helpless, my breath ripped from my lungs by the sheer velocity of the plunge. And then, just as abruptly as it had begun, it ended. I hit the ground with a bone-jarring impact, the force knocking the air from my chest and sending sharp, blinding pain radiating through my body. For a moment, I lay there, sprawled on the cold, hard surface, my mind struggling to catch up with what had just happened. The air was thick and damp, heavy with a metallic tang that clung to the back of my throat. When I finally opened my eyes, I found myself staring into a darkness that was deeper than anything I had ever known. The glow started faintly, a soft, pulsing light that seemed to emanate from the walls around me. It was the same cold, unnatural light I had seen in the chamber, but here it was more intense, more alive. The jagged symbols etched into the stone pulsed in time with the vibrations in the ground, their edges glowing with a faint bluish hue. The air was colder here, biting and sharp, and every breath sent a searing pain through my chest. I pushed myself to my feet, my legs trembling beneath me as I scanned my surroundings. I was in another chamber, larger than the first, its walls towering high above me and disappearing into the darkness. The floor was uneven, covered in a thick layer of frost that crunched beneath my boots as I took a cautious step forward. The light from the runes illuminated the space just enough to make out the faint outlines of structures, twisted, unnatural shapes that jutted from the ground like frozen stalagmites. The whispers returned, softer this time, threading through the silence like a melody just out of reach. They weren't as frantic as before. They were calm now, almost soothing, and yet they filled me with a sense of dread that made my stomach churn. They weren't warning me anymore. They were guiding me. My flashlight was gone, lost in the fall, but the runes provided enough light to see the path ahead. It wasn't a path in the traditional sense, but I could feel it, a pull that urged me forward, deeper into the chamber. The air grew colder with each step, the vibrations in the ground more pronounced, and the whispers more insistent. The jagged symbols on the walls pulsed in time with the thrum beneath my feet, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the chamber itself was alive, breathing, watching. The ground sloped downward, the frost growing thicker, and soon I found myself standing at the edge of a massive circular pit. The light from the runes reflected off the ice that lined its edges, casting eerie, flickering shadows across the walls. The pit was deep, its bottom obscured by a swirling mist that seemed to glow faintly with its own light. The whispers were louder here, their tones shifting from calm to something more urgent, more demanding. They wanted me to look. I stepped closer, my breath fogging in the frigid air, and peered over the edge. The pit was not empty. At its center, suspended above the swirling mist, was a figure. It was massive, its form shifting and warping as though it couldn't fully exist in this plane. Its limbs were long and spindly, its body twisted and distorted, and its face, or what passed for one, was a featureless void. The runes on the walls pulsed in time with its movements, their light flickering as though in response to its presence. It wasn't bound by the mist. It was the mist, its form coalescing and dispersing with each pulse of light. It wasn't just alive. It was awake. The whispers in my head reached a fever pitch, their fragmented voices blending into a single resonant tone that vibrated through my skull. They weren't speaking in words, but their meaning was clear. The pit was a prison, the runes a seal, and the figure below me was its captive. The artifact I had found, had touched, was the key, and I had undone the lock. The ground beneath me trembled violently, the frost cracking underfoot as the air grew heavier, denser. The figure began to rise, its movements slow and deliberate, its body stretching upward as though pulled by invisible strings. The runes on the walls flared brightly, their light sharp and searing, and the whispers shifted again, their tone desperate now, pleading. "Seal it." The words weren't mine, but they echoed in my mind with a force that made my knees buckle. I dropped to the ground, my hands pressing against the frost as I struggled to catch my breath. The runes pulsed faster, their light growing brighter, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. "Seal it." I didn't know how. I didn't know what to do, but the chamber did. The pull I had felt earlier returned, stronger now, dragging me toward the edge of the pit. My body moved on its own, my legs trembling as I stood and stepped forward, closer to the figure that now loomed high above me. The mist swirled violently, the vibrations in the ground reaching a crescendo as the figure stretched toward the ceiling, its limbs twisting and bending in impossible ways. And then I saw it. At the edge of the pit, half buried in the frost, was a small, jagged object. The artifact. Its surface was cracked, its glow faint, but it pulsed in time with the runes, its light syncing with the vibrations in the ground. I reached for it, my fingers brushing against the cold, rough surface, and a jolt of electricity shot through me, sharp and searing. The whispers screamed in unison, their voices piercing and deafening, as the artifact flared to life in my hands. The figure above me froze, its body trembling as the light from the runes grew blinding. The air was heavy with energy, the chamber vibrating violently as the ground beneath me cracked and splintered. The artifact grew hotter in my hands, its light burning through the frost and into the mist below. And then, with a sound like the shattering of glass, the pit collapsed. The figure let out a sound that wasn't a scream, but felt like one, its form disintegrating into the mist as the ground swallowed it whole. The runes flared one final time before fading, their light extinguished as the vibrations ceased. The whispers were gone, replaced by a silence so profound it felt like the air had been sucked from the room. I dropped the artifact, my hands trembling, and watched as it shattered against the frost, its light fading into nothing. The chamber was still now, the air cold and empty, and for the first time I felt truly alone. I don't know how I made it out of the pit, how I climbed back to the surface, but when I emerged into the storm, the forest was silent. The snow had stopped falling, the wind had died, and the world was still. The pit was sealed, but I knew it wouldn't hold forever. Nothing ever does. The highway stretched endlessly before me, a slick ribbon of ice disappearing into the blinding white of the storm. The snow came down in sheets, relentless and suffocating, the wind howling through the trees that lined the road like skeletal sentinels. My headlights cut a narrow path through the blizzard, the beam barely illuminating more than a few feet ahead, but it was enough to keep me moving. Enough to keep me from stopping. I told myself I wasn't afraid, that this was just another run, just another stretch of desolate road to cross, before I reached the research outpost and handed off the supplies. But the truth was, I'd been uneasy the moment I set out. The highway had a reputation, one whispered about by truckers and locals alike, though never loudly, never with too much conviction. Accidents happened here, they said. Vehicles abandoned, drivers gone without a trace. The stories varied, but the message was always the same. This stretch of road was cursed. And now, with the blizzard closing in and the temperature plummeting, I was beginning to understand why. The storm had been building for hours, the early afternoon sky darkening until it felt more like midnight. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, my knuckles white as the truck jolted over another patch of ice. The heater struggled to keep up with the cold, and I could see my breath fogging the air despite the vents blasting hot air at full power. I glanced at the dashboard. The clock read 4:12 p.m., but it might as well have been midnight for all the light I could see outside. The temperature gauge hovered dangerously low, a constant reminder of just how hostile the world outside my cab had become. I was alone out here. At least, that's what I told myself. There hadn't been another vehicle on the road for miles, not since I'd passed the last gas station at dawn. The isolation was suffocating, the silence broken only by the growl of the engine and the faint rattle of the chains on my tires. But as the storm intensified, as the snow piled higher and the wind screamed louder, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't paranoia. It was instinct. A deep, primal awareness that I was not alone on this highway. The first sign of trouble came just after the next bend, a faint, flickering light cutting through the storm. I slowed the truck, the tires crunching against the icy road, and squinted through the windshield. At first, I thought it was another vehicle, its hazard lights flashing weakly in the distance. Relief flooded through me, a brief reprieve from the gnawing isolation. But as I drew closer, that relief twisted into unease. The car was half buried in the snow, its front end tilted into a shallow ditch. The windshield was frosted over, the wipers frozen mid-swipe, and the driver's side door hung ajar, creaking faintly in the wind. The hazard lights flickered sporadically, their rhythm uneven, as though the vehicle itself was struggling to stay alive. There were no tracks leading away from it, no footprints in the snow, no signs of movement. Just the car, abandoned and alone. I pulled the truck to a stop a few yards away, leaving the engine running as I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out into the storm. The cold hit me like a physical force, stealing the breath from my lungs and biting through my coat. The snow was up to my shins, and every step was a struggle, the wind driving icy needles against my exposed skin. The flashlight beam trembled as I approached the car, the light cutting through the storm and casting long, jagged shadows across the snow. The interior of the car was a frozen tomb. Frost coated the dashboard, the seats, the windows, thick and impenetrable, as though the cold had seeped in and claimed the vehicle for itself. The keys were still in the ignition, but the engine was silent, the battery long dead. The faint smell of gasoline lingered in the air, mingling with the metallic tang of frost. And then I saw the handprints. They smeared the inside of the windshield, faint and ghostly, as though someone had pressed their palms against the glass and dragged them downward. The prints were uneven, distorted, and far too large to belong to any human I had ever seen. My stomach turned as I stared at them, my breath fogging the glass as I leaned closer. The snow swirled around me, the storm growing louder, and for a moment I thought I heard something, faint and distant, carried on the wind. A voice. It wasn't a scream, not exactly. It was softer than that, more deliberate, like someone calling out from the depths of the storm. The sound sent a shiver down my spine, and I turned quickly, scanning the road and the snowbanks for any sign of movement. The flashlight beam cut through the blizzard, illuminating nothing but endless white. But the voice came again, faint and insistent, and this time it was closer. I stumbled back toward the truck, the flashlight trembling in my hand as the storm closed in around me. The wind howled, the snow stinging against my skin, and the voice grew louder, its tone rising and falling like the wail of the wind. I slammed the truck door shut behind me, my chest heaving as I gripped the steering wheel, the flashlight falling to the floor. The heater blasted lukewarm air against my face, but it did nothing to chase away the chill that had settled in my bones. The hazard lights on the car flickered once more before going dark, leaving the vehicle swallowed by the storm. I shifted the truck into gear, the tires spinning briefly before catching traction, and pulled back onto the highway. The voice faded as I drove away, replaced by the relentless growl of the engine and the rhythmic crunch of chains against ice. But the unease lingered, heavy and suffocating, as though the storm itself was pressing against the cab, trying to find a way in. And then the radio crackled to life. At first, it was just static, faint and intermittent, like the distant echo of a long-forgotten broadcast. But as I listened, the static grew sharper, more distinct, until it formed a pattern, a rhythm that matched the pounding of my heart. The sound was wrong, unnatural, like a voice speaking through broken glass. And then, beneath the static, I heard it, breathing, faint and shallow, each inhale crackling through the speakers like dry leaves. My hands tightened on the wheel, my pulse pounding in my ears as I stared straight ahead, the road a blur of white and black. The breathing grew louder, more labored, until it filled the cab, drowning out the storm and the engine and everything else. And then, just as abruptly as it had started, it stopped. I was alone again, but the silence was worse. The silence clung to me, heavier than the storm outside. My truck's engine growled steadily, but even that sound felt muted, swallowed by the vast emptiness pressing against the cab. I adjusted my grip on the wheel, the leather cold beneath my palms, and forced myself to focus on the road ahead. The snowstorm showed no signs of easing. It was as though the world had been blanketed in white and smothered in stillness. The highway stretched on, twisting and turning through the frozen landscape, its edges blurred by the storm. The faint rumble of the tires on the ice should have been reassuring, but it wasn't. Every mile brought with it a sense of foreboding, like I was driving deeper into something I wasn't supposed to see, something that didn't want me here. The static from the radio had stopped, but I could still hear it in my mind, the faint, rhythmic crackle threading through my thoughts like a distant echo. The truck jolted suddenly, sliding slightly to one side as the tires hit a patch of uneven ice. My heart leapt into my throat, and I gritted my teeth, fighting to regain control. The storm made everything treacherous, visibility near zero, the road a treacherous labyrinth of hidden dangers. I glanced at the dashboard, my eyes darting to the temperature gauge. It had dropped even lower, the needle hovering at the edge of the red. The heater was losing its battle against the cold, the edges of the windshield frosting over despite the warm air blasting from the vents. The snow seemed to grow heavier, the flakes larger and denser, swirling in chaotic patterns that danced in the headlights. It almost felt alive, moving with purpose, as though it were trying to obscure something just beyond my sight. I leaned forward, squinting through the windshield, trying to make out the road ahead. That's when I saw it, a shadow moving through the storm, faint and indistinct, but unmistakably there. I slowed the truck, my fingers tightening around the wheel as I peered into the blizzard. The shadow was gone as quickly as it had appeared, swallowed by the swirling snow, but it had been there. I was sure of it. A figure, walking along the side of the road, its outline blurred but solid enough to make my stomach twist. No one should have been out here. Not in this storm. Not in this cold. The truck shuddered as I braked, the tires skidding slightly on the icy surface before coming to a halt. I sat there for a moment, the engine idling, my breath fogging the air as I debated what to do. The storm howled around me, the wind rattling the cab, but I couldn't shake the image of the figure from my mind. It hadn't been walking toward me or away from me. It had been standing still, as though waiting. I rolled down the window just enough to stick my head out, the freezing air biting into my skin as I scanned the road. Snow lashed against my face, stinging like needles, and the wind roared in my ears, drowning out everything else. But the road was empty, the shadows gone. The only movement was the relentless swirl of snow, twisting and writhing like a living thing. I sat back, pulling the window up and cranking the heater as high as it would go. The warmth was weak, barely enough to thaw the chill that had settled into my bones. My hands trembled as I gripped the wheel, my pulse hammering in my ears. I told myself it had been a trick of the storm, a shadow cast by the headlights, or a stray tree branch caught in the wind. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The road ahead seemed darker now, the headlights struggling to cut through the blizzard. The snowbanks on either side loomed higher, their edges jagged and sharp, like frozen waves crashing against the edges of the highway. The storm was worsening, the wind screaming through the narrow stretch of road and making the truck sway slightly with each gust. I pressed down on the accelerator, urging the vehicle forward, but the sense of unease only grew stronger. That's when the radio crackled to life again. It started softly, just a faint hiss of static threading through the cab, but it grew louder, more distinct, until it filled the space with a low, rhythmic pulse. I reached for the dial, my fingers trembling, and turned the volume down, but it didn't help. The static wasn't coming from the radio. It was coming from somewhere deeper, somewhere I couldn't reach. The sound shifted, the static breaking apart into faint whispers, barely audible but unmistakably there. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was wrong, sharp and distorted, like voices heard underwater. They overlapped and intertwined, threading through the static in an unnatural, dissonant harmony that made my skin crawl. And then, just for a moment, the whispers stopped. A single faint voice broke through the static, clear and unmistakable. "Turn back." The word sent a chill through me, colder than the air outside. I froze, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly that my knuckles ached. The voice was gone as quickly as it had come, replaced by the hiss of static, but its weight lingered, pressing against my chest like an invisible hand. My eyes darted to the rearview mirror, scanning the empty expanse of road behind me, but there was nothing there. Nothing I could see, at least. The truck jolted again, snapping me out of my trance as the tires hit another patch of uneven ice. I forced myself to focus, my breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps as I gritted my teeth and fought to steady the vehicle. The storm was relentless now, the wind tearing at the truck like a living thing, and the road ahead was nothing but a swirling void of white and black. I drove for what felt like hours, though it couldn't have been more than a few minutes. The static from the radio faded, replaced by the relentless growl of the engine and the rhythmic crunch of chains against ice. The shadows on the road grew bolder, darker, shifting at the edges of my vision before disappearing into the storm. I tried to ignore them, tried to focus on the road, but they were everywhere, moving just out of reach, just out of sight. And then, up ahead, I saw it. A faint glow, flickering through the storm like a dying ember. It was too small to be another vehicle, too steady to be the headlights of oncoming traffic. It was something else, something that didn't belong. My stomach twisted as I pressed down on the brakes, the truck shuddering to a stop. The glow grew brighter, more distinct, casting faint, jagged shadows across the snow. And in the center of it, just barely visible through the blizzard, was a figure. It was waiting for me. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, motionless in the middle of the road, as though it had been waiting for me all along. The glow around it wasn't natural. It didn't flicker like fire, nor did it pulse like the distant lights of a vehicle. It was steady, cold, and unearthly, casting long, unnatural shadows across the snow-covered ground. My headlights barely illuminated its shape, and what I could make out made my stomach twist in a way that was almost unbearable. It was tall, too tall to be a person, but its outline was vaguely humanoid. Its limbs were long and thin, its body crooked at the joints, as though it had been bent or broken and hastily pieced back together. The head tilted slightly, angling toward me, though it didn't have a face, or if it did, I couldn't see it. Just a smooth, pale void where features should have been. The longer I stared, the more wrong it looked, as though its very presence was a violation of the space it occupied. I couldn't move. My hands stayed glued to the wheel, my foot hovering above the brake pedal. But I couldn't press it, couldn't shift into reverse. It felt like my body wasn't mine anymore, as though the cold had seeped into my muscles and turned them to ice. My breath fogged the windshield, obscuring my view, but I didn't dare wipe it away. I didn't want to see anymore. The glow began to spread, bleeding outward across the snow, and with it came the sound. It was faint at first, a low rhythmic hum that vibrated through the air and settled deep in my chest. It wasn't like anything I'd ever heard. It wasn't mechanical, wasn't human. It was deeper than that, a resonant pulse that seemed to come from the earth itself, as though the highway was alive and groaning under the weight of something ancient and immense. The figure moved, not quickly, not deliberately, but in a slow, jerky motion that was almost worse than if it had lunged at me. Its limbs shifted unnaturally, bending and twisting as it took a step forward, then another. It didn't walk. It drifted, its feet, or what passed for feet, barely touching the snow as it moved closer to the truck. The glow around it grew brighter with each step, the shadows stretching and contorting like living things, and I could feel the hum growing louder, more insistent, vibrating through my bones. Something snapped inside me, and I slammed the truck into reverse, my foot stomping down on the gas. The tires spun uselessly for a moment before catching traction, the truck lurching backward as the figure continued its slow, steady approach. The headlights washed over it, illuminating the pale, smooth void of its face, and I swore I saw something there, something dark and shifting, just beneath the surface. It wasn't empty. It was watching me. The truck slid slightly as I reversed down the highway, the chains on the tires clattering against the ice. The figure didn't follow, not immediately, but its presence lingered, pressing against the cab like a physical weight. The glow faded as I put more distance between us, swallowed by the storm, but the hum stayed with me, reverberating in my chest long after the figure had disappeared from view. I didn't stop. I couldn't. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst, my breaths coming in short, ragged gasps as I fought to keep the truck steady. The storm had worsened, the snow blinding now, and the road ahead was nothing but a shifting void of white. My hands trembled on the wheel, my fingers numb despite the heat blasting from the vents. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure standing in the middle of the road, but it wasn't there. The highway was empty again, but the sense of wrongness hadn't lifted. It clung to me like frost, sinking into my skin and weighing down my every thought. I didn't know what I had seen, what I had almost seen, but I knew it wasn't over. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't gone. Not really. It was still out there, somewhere, and it was waiting. The radio crackled to life again, startling me so badly I nearly lost control of the truck. The static was sharper now, louder, and beneath it, I could hear faint whispers threading through the noise. They weren't words, not exactly, but they carried a meaning that I couldn't explain. A warning, maybe, or a threat. I reached for the dial, my fingers brushing against the cold plastic, but before I could turn it off, the static cut out abruptly. And then the voice came through. It wasn't like before. This wasn't an echo. wasn't my own words distorted and played back to me. This voice was something else, low and guttural, with a tone that made my skin crawl. It wasn't speaking English, or any language I could recognize, but I understood it all the same. The words twisted in my mind, foreign and yet familiar, filling me with a sense of dread so profound I thought I might be sick. The voice stopped, leaving behind a silence that was somehow worse than the noise. I glanced at the rearview mirror again, my breath catching in my throat as I scanned the empty highway. The storm raged on, the snow piling higher, but the figure wasn't there. Or at least, it wasn't where I could see it. The truck shuddered as I hit another patch of uneven ice, jolting me back to the present. I forced my eyes back to the road, my pulse racing as the headlights illuminated a new stretch of highway. The snowbanks on either side were taller now, their edges sharp and jagged, and for a moment I thought I saw something moving within them. A shadow, flickering just out of sight, its shape too quick and too faint to fully register. I told myself it was the storm, the snow playing tricks on my eyes, but deep down, I knew better. The hum returned, faint at first, but growing louder with each passing moment. It wasn't coming from the radio this time. It was coming from the road itself, a low, resonant vibration that made the truck tremble beneath me. The shadows in the snowbanks grew darker, more defined, and I could feel something watching me, its gaze heavy and unrelenting. I pressed down on the accelerator, the engine roaring as the truck picked up speed. The hum grew louder, the vibrations shaking the cab, and for a moment I thought I saw the glow again, faint and flickering in the distance. The road ahead seemed to stretch endlessly, the storm swallowing everything in its path, and the only thing I could do was keep moving. Because if I stopped, I knew it would catch me. The highway seemed endless, a twisting vein carved into the frozen wilderness with no beginning and no end. The storm raged on, more relentless than ever, the wind howling like a living thing determined to strip away every ounce of warmth and resolve I had left. The hum in the air hadn't faded. If anything, it had grown louder, vibrating through the truck, through the road, through me. It wasn't just a sound, it was a presence, heavy and oppressive, pressing down on me with each passing second. I couldn't shake the feeling that the truck wasn't mine anymore. It still responded when I turned the wheel, when I pressed the accelerator, but something about the way it moved felt off, as though I was no longer in control, just a passenger being carried forward towards some unseen destination. The headlights barely cut through the swirling snow, the beam flickering slightly, and I kept glancing at the dashboard, as if expecting to see something wrong. But everything looked normal. Everything except the temperature gauge, which had dropped below its lowest marking, the needle quivering like it wanted to shatter. The whispers returned, threading through the storm like strands of frost-laden wire. They were faint at first, indistinct and fragmented, but they grew louder the farther I drove, their voices overlapping in an eerie, dissonant harmony. I didn't understand the words, or if they even were words, but they carried a weight that made my chest tighten and my pulse race. They were coming from somewhere just outside the truck, carried on the wind, wrapping around the cab like fingers tapping on glass. I tightened my grip on the wheel, my knuckles white, and focused on the road. But it wasn't a road anymore, not really. The edges were blurred, swallowed by the snow, and the asphalt had vanished beneath a thick, uneven layer of ice. The truck jolted violently as the tires hit a patch of rough terrain, and I had to fight to keep it steady. The snowbanks on either side loomed higher now, almost vertical, and they seemed to pulse faintly in the glow of the headlights, as though they were alive. And then I saw it. Up ahead, barely visible through the storm, was a structure. It was small and dilapidated, its roof half collapsed under the weight of the snow, but it was unmistakably there, a roadside diner, its neon sign flickering weakly in the darkness. The letters were broken, most of them unreadable, but the faint glow of the remaining bulbs was enough to send a wave of relief crashing through me. A place to stop, to gather my thoughts, to feel human again, at least for a moment. I pulled the truck to a stop just outside the diner, the tires crunching against the frozen ground. The engine groaned as I killed it, the sudden silence deafening after hours of its relentless growl. For a moment, I sat there, staring through the windshield at the building, my breath fogging the glass. The neon sign buzzed faintly, the letters flickering sporadically, and the snow piled high against the walls, partially obscuring the windows. Ah! It looked abandoned. It felt abandoned. But the light was still on. I stepped out into the storm, the cold slamming into me with a ferocity that made me gasp. The wind tore at my coat, driving snow against my face and into my eyes, but I forced myself forward, my boots crunching through the ice-crusted drifts. The whispers followed me, faint but insistent, threading through the wind in a way that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I glanced over my shoulder as I reached the door, scanning the highway for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. Just the swirling white void of the storm. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the sound sharp and jarring against the muffled roar of the wind. The air inside was stale and frigid, carrying the faint metallic tang of frost and decay. The diner was dark, except for the weak glow of the neon sign filtering through the windows, casting faint, flickering shadows across the walls. The tables and booths were covered in a thin layer of frost, their surfaces cracked and warped from the cold. Plates of food sat untouched, frozen solid, the remnants of long-abandoned meals. I stepped farther inside, the floorboards groaning under my weight, and scanned the room. It was eerily preserved, as though the people who had once filled this place had simply vanished, leaving everything behind. A coffee mug sat on the counter, its contents frozen into a solid block, the handle still faintly warm from the heat of a hand that hadn't touched it in decades. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I realized they weren't coming from outside anymore. They were here, in the diner, threading through the cracks in the walls, emanating from the frost-covered surfaces. There was something on the counter. A book, or maybe a journal, its leather cover cracked and warped, the pages stiff with frost. I reached for it, my fingers trembling as I brushed away the layer of snow that had settled on top. The whispers surged as I opened it, the pages cracking slightly under the pressure, and my eyes scanned the uneven, hastily scrawled handwriting. The words were fragmented, disjointed, but they told a story of travelers who had come before me, drawn to this place by the same unseen force that had pulled me here. The entries were short, each one ending abruptly, but the tone was unmistakable. Fear. Desperation. A growing sense of something ancient and malevolent closing in. The final entry was smeared with a dark, frozen stain, the words barely legible. It watches from the snow. It takes what it wants. Don't look. Don't. The sound of glass cracking snapped me out of my trance. I turned sharply, the journal slipping from my fingers and landing on the counter with a dull thud. The frost-covered windows were trembling, thin cracks spidering across their surfaces as the whispers reached a fever pitch. The air grew colder, so cold it burned, and I could feel something pressing against the walls, against the door. The diner groaned, the sound low and guttural, like a living thing under immense pressure. And then the lights went out. The darkness was absolute, smothering, and for a moment I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The whispers stopped, replaced by a silence so profound it felt like the world had ended. And then, just as I was about to reach for my flashlight, I heard it, the faint sound of footsteps on the frost-covered floor, slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere deep within the diner. I wasn't alone. The footsteps echoed in the silence, slow and deliberate, as though whoever or whatever was walking had all the time in the world. My pulse thundered in my ears, drowning out everything else as I pressed my back against the counter, my breath shallow and fogging the air in quick bursts. The air in the diner felt thicker now, heavier, like the weight of the storm outside had seeped into the walls. I couldn't see anything, not the source of the footsteps, not the frost-covered windows, not even my own shaking hands. The only thing I could hear, aside from the footsteps, was the faint creak of the floorboards beneath my feet. The darkness wasn't natural. It was alive, pulsating faintly, wrapping around me like a smothering blanket. My flashlight was still in my pocket, but I couldn't bring myself to reach for it. Some instinct buried deep in my mind told me that light wouldn't save me. It might even make things worse. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, so deep and profound it made my chest ache. I strained to listen, every nerve in my body screaming at me to move, to run, but I couldn't. My muscles were locked in place, frozen by a fear so intense it felt like it had seeped into my very bones. The darkness seemed to shift around me, subtle but undeniable, and I felt it, a presence, cold and malevolent, standing just out of reach. And then the whispers began again. They were faint at first, threading through the air like strands of silk, but they grew louder with each passing second, their voices overlapping in a chaotic, discordant melody. They didn't sound human. They didn't sound like anything I could recognize. They were fragmented, distorted, as though the words were being dragged through the void and twisted into something unrecognizable. I couldn't make sense of them, but I didn't need to. The intent behind them was clear. I wasn't supposed to be here. The air around me grew colder, so cold it burned, and I could feel the frost creeping up the edges of my coat, biting into my skin through the fabric. The floor beneath me groaned, the sound low and guttural, and I realized with a sickening certainty that it wasn't the diner groaning. It was the thing in the darkness. The footsteps started again, louder this time, moving closer. I could hear the faint crunch of frost underfoot, the creak of old wood bending beneath a weight that felt far too heavy to be human. My breath caught in my throat as the whispers grew louder, almost deafening, and I realized that they weren't coming from all around me anymore. They were coming from directly behind me. I turned, slowly, every instinct screaming at me not to, but I couldn't stop myself. The darkness seemed to part just enough for me to see it. A figure standing just a few feet away, its outline shifting and warping as though it didn't belong in this world. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs stretched and elongated, and its face, it didn't have a face. Or, rather, it had too many faces, all of them shifting and overlapping, blurring together in a way that made my stomach twist violently. It didn't move. It didn't have to. The weight of its presence was enough to press me against the counter, the cold seeping into my chest and stealing the breath from my lungs. The whispers were deafening now, a cacophony of voices that filled my head and drowned out my thoughts. My vision blurred, the edges of the figure dissolving into the darkness, and for a moment I thought I was going to pass out. And then it reached for me. Its hand, or what passed for a hand, stretched forward, the fingers too long, too thin, ending in jagged points that glinted faintly in the darkness. I stumbled backward, my foot catching on the edge of the counter, and fell hard onto the frost-covered floor. The impact jarred me, breaking the spell just enough for me to scramble to my feet and bolt toward the door. The whispers followed me, sharp and insistent, threading through the air like barbed wire. The darkness seemed to pulse around me, alive and hungry, and I could feel the figure moving, its presence pressing against my back like a physical weight. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I just ran, my boot slipping on the frost-slicked floor as I barreled toward the faint outline of the door. I hit it shoulder first, the wood splintering beneath the force, and stumbled out into the storm. The cold air hit me like a wall, sharp and biting, but I didn't stop. The snow was deeper now, almost up to my knees, and every step felt like a battle as I pushed forward, away from the diner, away from the thing inside. The whispers didn't stop. They followed me into the storm, threading through the howling wind, growing fainter but no less insistent. I made it to the truck, my hands trembling so violently that it took me 3 tries to get the door open. I climbed inside, slamming it shut behind me, and fumbled with the keys, my breath fogging the air in short, shallow gasps. The engine roared to life, the sound a sharp contrast to the suffocating silence of the diner, and I floored the accelerator, the tires spinning briefly before catching traction. The diner disappeared behind me, swallowed by the storm, but the whispers didn't fade. They stayed with me, faint and persistent, threading through the hum of the engine and the growl of the tires. I drove blindly, the road a blur of white and black, the storm closing in around me like a living thing. My hands were numb on the wheel, my vision blurred by exhaustion and fear, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't even think. And then, the road ended. I didn't see it coming, didn't realize what had happened until it was too late. The truck skidded, the tires screaming against the ice, and I felt the weightless, sickening lurch of freefall. The world spun around me, a chaotic blur of snow and darkness, and then there was nothing. I woke to silence. The storm was gone, the highway still, but the whispers, they were louder than ever.